Hey guys, tonight we're going back to the Middle Ages, roughly the 12th to 14th centuries, when marriage was less about romance and more about property, alliances, and duty. We'll be exploring what really happened on those much imagined wedding nights, the kind of details that history often leaves tucked away in dusty records. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Congratulations, you just woke up in the late 13th century, somewhere in a small market town in northern France. The smell of wood smoke lingers in the air, mixed with the faint, sour sweetness of ale that has been left sitting too long in the heat of the day. Around you, the narrow timber, framed houses lean slightly toward one another, almost touching at their upper stories, creating dark passageways where the late afternoon light hardly reaches. It is a wedding day, and the entire town seems to be humming with the rhythm of drums, pipes, and gossip. Medieval weddings were not primarily about love. For most people, they were about duty, inheritance, and survival. In noble households, a marriage might be carefully negotiated over several years, contracts drawn up by clerks, blessings sought from bishops, and dowries tallied like entries in a ledger. For peasants and townsfolk, the arrangements were simpler, but the principle was the same. Marriage created stability, bound two families together, and ensured property and labor were passed to the next generation. And now, as you stand at the edge of the market square, the newly married couple has just finished their public feast. The tables are sticky with honey cakes and scraps of roasted meat. Children scurry about collecting drop bones to gnaw, and older men lean on benches, debating loudly about the price of barley. The bride sits quietly, eyes lowered, as laughter swells around her. The groom, already flushed with oil, tries to look confident. He knows what is coming next, because the medieval wedding night was not just a private moment. In many cases, it was a semi-public ritual. The first thing to understand is that marriage was a community affair. The union wasn't considered truly valid until it had been witnessed, celebrated, and, in a sense, confirmed by the people around you. Today we think of the honeymoon as an escape from family and obligation. But in the Middle Ages, the opposite was often true. Families, neighbors, and sometimes even local lords wanted proof that the marriage had been consummated. This led to a custom known as the bedding ceremony. After the feast, the bride and groom were escorted to their chamber, sometimes the main room of the house, sometimes a curtained bed in an inn, sometimes a hastily swept corner of a farmhouse. Torches flickered, jests were shouted, and guests, who had often been drinking since midday, crowded around the doorway to make sure the ritual was carried out properly. It wasn't always dignified. Records from France, Germany, and England describe a mixture of solemn blessing and raucous mischief. Priests might sprinkle holy water on the bed, invoking God's protection for the couple's union. At the same time, young men might toss nuts or dried peas at the bedclothes, a fertility symbol that doubled as a practical joke. Sometimes shoes were thrown, or the sheets tugged aside with a laugh, though not always to the bride's amusement. You can imagine the tension in the rooms. A bride who may have never spoken more than a few words to her new husband, now expected to lie beside him under the watchful eyes of family and friends. A groom who knows that whispers of his inadequacy could haunt his reputation for years. The flickering shadows, the smell of tallow candles, the sound of muffled laughter from beyond the doorway, all of it pressing down on the bed like an unwelcome guest. But what happened once the door closed or the curtains were drawn? Here is where our expectations often collide with reality. We picture wedding nights as moments of passion, or at least awkward intimacy. But for many medieval couples, the first night was anticlimactic. Marriage was a legal bond before it was a romantic one. The act of consummation was expected, but it was not always immediate. For noble families, particularly among royalty, consummation could be delayed for years, until both spouses were deemed old enough. A girl might be married at 12 or 13, but her bedding night might involve little more than sharing a bed fully clothed, to show that the union had begun. There are accounts of young brides sleeping with dolls or rosaries clutched in their hands, while priests reassured their parents that the marriage would be perfected at the proper age. For peasants and townsfolk, the matter was often more straightforward but no less awkward. Privacy was scarce in medieval homes. The newlyweds might share their bed with younger siblings, grandparents, or even traveling strangers. Curtains and wooden partitions offered some separation, but sound carried easily through timber walls. A bride and groom might find themselves whispering in the dark, surrounded by the soft snoring of their extended family. And yet, despite the lack of privacy, consummation mattered deeply. The church taught that a marriage was incomplete without it. Lawyers and bishops wrote long, dry treatises debating what counted as consummation, how it could be proven, and what should be done if a husband or wife claimed impotence. Entire court cases hinged on whether or not two people had truly slept together. Sometimes servants were called to inspect the bed linens in the morning. In rare but well-documented cases, witnesses even lingered in the room during the act itself. Though this seems to have been more symbolic than literal. You might be wondering, what did the bride and groom themselves think of all this? Surviving letters and poems give us some clues, though they are rare. A noblewoman in 14th century England wrote that she dreaded her wedding night more than childbirth. A German merchant's wife recalled in her diary that she and her husband laughed nervously, drank watered wine, and then lay still, speaking of the harvest. The impression we get is not of fiery passion, but of wary acceptance, a sense of duty, mixed with the faint hope that companionship might grow in time. And there were practical concerns. Bedding a wife was not simply about producing children, though that was the ultimate goal. It was also about inheritance. A nobleman without heirs risked losing his lands to rival branches of the family. A peasant without sons might struggle to keep his plot from being absorbed by a neighbor. Marriage was the machinery that kept society turning, and the wedding night was the crank that set it in motion. So when the laughter outside died down, when the last torch guttered in the doorway, the couple would lie together, listening to the creak of the bed frame and the restless scratching of mice in the straw. Some consummated their union immediately, others waited. But either way, the expectations of family, community, and church weighed on their shoulders, pressing them into the bedclothes as heavily as the coarse wool blankets. And that raises a question in a world where love was secondary, privacy scarce, and the community so invested in what happened behind closed doors. How did couples themselves find space for intimacy? The room is dark now, though not completely silent. Somewhere outside, a drunken guest sings off-key, his voice carrying down the street. A dog barks in answer. Inside the chamber, the couple lies still, waiting for the weight of expectation to fade. Yet the medieval wedding night was never only about two people and their emotions. It was about law, custom, and the invisible threads that tied entire communities together. To understand this, we need to look beyond the bed itself and into the layers of ritual that framed the night. In much of Europe, the wedding day unfolded like a carefully rehearsed performance. The feast was the climax of public celebration, but the bedding was its coda, the moment that tied the performance into something binding and real. Chroniclers describe the bedding ceremony as noisy, bawdy, and strangely formal. Guests might parade the couple to the chamber with torches and song, shouting rhymes that blurred the line between blessing and mockery. In some regions, the groom was stripped to his shirt, the bride to her shift, and they were tucked into bed by older relatives who offered instructions on fertility and fidelity. There was humor in this, but also a deep sense of continuity. Just as the church sanctified the vows spoken at the altar, the community sanctified the act that followed. To the medieval mind, words alone were not enough. A contract was only as good as the evidence that backed it, and in the case of marriage, that evidence was the couple's union. It's easy, from our modern perspective, to view this as intrusive or absurd. But for medieval people, Marriage was not primarily private, it was a public bond with public consequences. Land might pass from one lineage to another. Dowries might be transferred, alliances sealed, and entire villages reshaped by the union of two households. The bedroom was, in that sense, a stage on which social order was enacted. But what of the differences between classes? The bedding ceremony of a peasant farmer was not the same as that of a king. Among nobles and royalty, the wedding night carried political weight. Chroniclers were often invited to record events, not in detail, but in terms of symbolism. For example, the marriage of Margaret of Scotland to Eric Tully of Norway in 1281 was accompanied by a bedding ritual described in lavish terms, with prayers, gifts, and ceremonial processions. Whether or not the couple actually consummated that married was less important than the public acknowledgement that they now belonged to one another. At the highest levels of society, consummation could even become a matter of international debate. When royal marriages were annulled, questions of impotence or non-consummation were dragged before courts and councils, with physicians, priests, and witnesses called to testify. The sheets of a wedding bed could become evidence in lawsuits that determined the fate of kingdoms. By contrast, for peasants, the bedding was practical, sometimes even perfunctory. Privacy was rare, so it might take place in the very same room where children were sleeping on straw mats or where grandparents dozed near the hearth. The bedding of common folk was less likely to be described in chronicles, but court records give us glimpses. In some cases, disputes over land or dowries forced villagers to testify about whether they had seen or heard evidence of consummation. The language is usually blunt and unpoetic. The man lay with her. They were in bed together. What unites both noble and peasant experience is the idea that consummation completed the contract. It was not romance, but proof. And yet, despite all this formality, there were elements of tenderness and adaptation. Many couples entered marriage with little prior familiarity. They might have met briefly during the betrothal, or even only on the wedding day itself. For some, the wedding night was a first hesitant step into companionship. For others, it was an obligation endured rather than embraced. The church advised moderation. Preachers warned couples not to overindulge in passion, especially on holy days or during fasts. Theologians like Thomas Aquinas wrote long passages on the purpose of marital intimacy, framing it as a duty ordered toward children rather than pleasure. Still, within these constraints, couples carved out their own understandings. Diaries, letters, and the occasional humorous song hint at the awkward laughter, whispered reassurances, and slow negotiation of boundaries that marked many a first night. Even the rituals could be adapted to soften the pressure. In some German towns, the community would symbolically put the couple to bed, but then leave them alone, content with the gesture rather than the reality. In other cases, the bride's family might remain in the room only long enough to bless the bed with holy water before retreating. These variations remind us that while the framework was rigid, the human experience within it could be flexible. Now imagine yourself again in that darkened room of a 13th century household. The bride and groom whisper, perhaps about the feast, perhaps about nothing at all. Outside, their families slowly drift away, the revelry giving way to quiet. The fire burns low, and the walls creak with the settling of the timber. Tomorrow, the marriage will be assumed complete. The families will act as though the duty has been fulfilled, and life will move forward. But what if it has not? What if the couple chose to wait, to ease into their union more gently? Would anyone know? Would anyone care? This is where the tension of the medieval wedding night lies. Not only in what was expected, but in the space between expectation and reality. Records tell us what should have happened, but human lives are rarely so neat. Somewhere in that space, between ritual and reality, lay the true experience of medieval couples. And that brings us to a larger question: how did these rituals of duty and formality shape the marriages that followed? Did they set the stage for companionship and resilience? Or did they burden couples with a weight they could never quite escape? Morning arrives slowly in the medieval town. A pale light filters through the shutters, carrying with it the smell of damp earth and chimney smoke. The church bells ring out across the fields, calling people to morning prayer. For the newly married couple, the wedding night is over, and with it begins the long, uncharted course of married life. It is easy, centuries later, to imagine this night as decisive, even defining. Yet for many medieval couples, the significance of the wedding night was not what happened between the sheets, but what followed in the days, months, and years ahead. Marriage was less about a single ritual than about the work of building a household, raising children, and surviving the endless rhythms of harvests, taxes, and seasons. Still, the echoes of the wedding night lingered. In noble courts, rumors about the success, or failure, of consummation could fuel gossip for years. Kings and queens sometimes saw their political legitimacy questioned if heirs did not arrive quickly enough. For peasants, the whispers of neighbors could shape reputations, marriages, and even disputes in the village courts. Records from ecclesiastical courts remind us how persistent these concerns were. When a marriage was challenged, judges often sought testimony about the wedding night itself. Had the couple shared a bed? Did witnesses see them undress? Was there evidence, however ambiguous, that the union had been consummated? In a society where law and religion were deeply intertwined, the wedding night could resurface years later as a point of legal argument. And so, while the experience itself may have been awkward, anticlimactic, or entirely uneventful, its symbolic weight was enormous. It was a hinge on which property, legitimacy, and lineage could turn. For the couple themselves, however, the wedding night often became just another thread in the fabric of married life. The more decisive trials lay ahead, surviving plagues and famines, keeping children alive through harsh winters, maintaining fields or businesses under the weight of taxes and obligations. Against those challenges, the awkwardness of the first night together may have seemed almost trivial. And yet it was not without meaning. For some, it was the first quiet moment shared with a stranger who would become a companion for life. For others, it was an uneasy initiation into a duty they had no choice but to fulfill. The wedding night was both intensely personal and profoundly public, both mundane and symbolically powerful. Looking across cultures, we find variations that underline this paradox. In parts of Italy, neighbors would wait outside the house for signs that the couple had settled in. In Scandinavia, fertility rituals sometimes involved symbolic offerings of bread, mead, or even livestock, underscoring the connection between marriage and survival. In England, the throwing of shoes or nuts onto the marriage bed became playful traditions that blurred the line between joke and blessing. Despite these differences, the pattern remained consistent. Marriage was a public contract, and the wedding night was its visible seal. But what lingers most is the humanity behind these rituals. Imagine the young bride, uncertain and wary, clutching at the coarse wool of her blanket as the noise of the feast finally fades. Imagine the groom, too aware of the weight of expectation, trying to summon confidence he does not yet feel. And then, imagine the quiet that follows, the soft breathing in the dark, the unspoken question of whether companionship, affection, or even love will one day take root. The medieval wedding night was not always a scene of romance. More often, it was a moment of negotiation, adaptation, and acceptance. But in its quiet way, it laid the foundation for households, lineages, and communities that would endure for generations. And so we are left with a reflection in a world where privacy was rare and marriage was bound by duty. Could intimacy ever truly belong to the couple themselves? Or was it always, in some measure, a performance for the community, the church, and the law? That question, unresolved as it is, lingers in the silence after the wedding bells, reminding us how much of human life is lived between expectation and reality. The marriage feast may have ended with a bedding, but the story of a medieval wedding began long before the couple ever shared a bed. If you were to walk through the market square of a medieval town in the 13th century, you might not notice the negotiations quietly taking place between fathers, uncles, and sometimes mothers, as they haggled not over the price of grain or wool, but over the future of their children. For most families, marriage was as much a transaction as it was a union, and the most visible sign of this was the dowry, a package of goods, land, or coin that accompanied a bride to her new household. The practice of dowries stretched back long before the Middle Ages, with roots in Roman law and even earlier traditions. But by the high medieval period, dowries had become a central part of European marriage. In cities like Florence or Venice, elaborate registers were kept, recording the details of every dowry, the amount of coin, the parcels of farmland, the chests of linens, sometimes even the number of copper pots. A bride without a dowry, it was said, was like a horse without a bridle, difficult to marry off and destined for a poorer match. For the nobility, dowries could be vast, serving as a kind of political currency. The marriage of a duke's daughter might bring entire castles or provinces into another family's control. The dowry was not just a gift. It was a form of leverage, a way for powerful families to build alliances and secure influence. The higher the bride's social rank, the larger and more complex the dowry negotiations became. But even among peasants and townsfolk, dowries mattered. A few sheep, a cow, or a patch of good land might make the difference between survival and hardship. Families often spent years saving for a daughter's dowry, putting aside coins from market sales or weaving extra cloth to sell at fairs. To marry off a daughter without a dowry was considered a failure, one that could cast shame on a household. And yet, the dowry was only part of the story. On the groom's side, there was often a bride price or mourning gift, a token of land, money, or goods given to the bride herself, not her family. This custom varied widely by region. In Northern Europe, the bride price was sometimes symbolic, a gesture acknowledging the value of the bride's role. In other places, it was substantial, forming a kind of insurance for the woman should she become widowed. Together, the dowry and the bride price created a balance of obligations. Marriage was not a one-sided transfer, but a negotiated contract, one that linked two households in a web of rights and duties. The language of these contracts was often dry, written in Latin or the local vernacular by clerks who specialized in legal formulae. A surviving example from 14th century France reads more like an inventory list than a declaration of love. Item, 2 beds with mattresses and coverlets. Item, 1 chest of oak. Item, 6 silver spoons. Item, the sum of 20 livres in coin. Behind the dull repetition of item lies a family's sacrifice, a daughter's future security, and the foundation of a new household. Imagine yourself in that moment. The bride's family gathered in the small room of a notary, the groom's kin standing opposite, the clerk dipping his quill into ink as he carefully records the terms. The bride herself might be silent, her role confined to agreement rather than negotiation. Yet her life is being measured out in coins, linens, and pots of honey. These contracts also reveal the surprising reach of marriage into daily survival. A dowry might include a set of tools, ensuring that the couple could farm or practice a craft. It might include clothing, sometimes listed down to the last pair of stockings, to ensure that the new household had enough to clothe its members. Even cooking pots and spinning wheels could appear in the records, mundane items that were nevertheless essential to a functioning home. In this way, marriage contracts were less about wealth than about continuity. They ensured that a new household could begin life equipped, however modestly, to endure the pressures of medieval existence. But dowries could also become a burden. Families sometimes bankrupted themselves trying to provide enough for their daughters. In Italian city-states, complaints were common that dowries had inflated to absurd proportions, forcing even wealthy households into debt. In response, some cities created dowry funds, public banks where families could deposit money over time, ensuring that daughters would receive their portion when the day of marriage came. At the other extreme, poor families might be forced to place daughters in convents, where the cost of entry was often lower than the cost of marriage. For these women, the cloister became an alternative form of security, though one that limited their role in society. And then there was the human side. The negotiations, sometimes tense, sometimes comical, that surrounded these arrangements. Letters survive from fathers complaining that their daughters' dowries had not been honored, or from grooms insisting that promised land was smaller or poorer than expected. In one case from England, A groom went so far as to measure the very fields he had been promised, only to accuse his new in-laws of deceit. Dowries, in short, were never just numbers on parchment. They were entangled with pride, reputation, and survival. So, as we return to the flickering torchlight of the medieval town, you can picture the contrast outside. Guests still laugh about the bedding, while inside, tucked away in strong boxes or recorded in fading ink, lies the true heart of the marriage. The contracts, the dowries, the careful balancing of goods that made the union possible. And here, a question lingers. When marriage was built so heavily on contracts and commodities, how much room was left for affection? Did love find a way to flourish within these structures, or was it always overshadowed by the weight of coin, land, and obligation? If you were to ask a medieval parent what kept them awake at night, the answer was rarely romance or youthful love. It was dowries, obligations, and the fear that promises made at a betrothal would not be fulfilled. The weight of marriage contracts stretched beyond the wedding day and into the very structure of family life. To begin with, dowries were not simply gifts exchanged at the moment of marriage. They often lived on in household memory for decades. A woman's dowry was technically her own property, though in practice, her husband managed it. If she were widowed, she might reclaim her dowry to support herself. If she bore children, the dowry helped guarantee their inheritance. In effect, a dowry was a kind of safety net, one of the few legal protections women could expect in a society that rarely granted them independent power. But safety nets can fray. If a husband squandered the dowry, sold it off, or lost it in bad harvests or wars, the wife could be left with little recourse. Some women pursued claims in court, petitioning bishops or secular judges to restore their rightful property. Surviving records from England, France, and Italy are filled with the same wary phrases. She claims the return of her dowry. She asserts her portion has not been honoured. The disputes might drag on for years, long after the wedding night had been forgotten. And what of the men? For grooms, the receipt of a dowry could transform their fortunes. A modest farmer who married a woman with a few acres of fertile land suddenly had more fields to till, more security against famine, and greater standing in the community. Merchants gained not only goods, but often valuable trading connections through their wives' families. For nobles, the dowry could mean the difference between maintaining a castle or slipping into obscurity. Yet this financial gain was balanced by obligation. In many regions, husbands were legally bound to repay the dowry if the marriage ended without children. This created a powerful incentive to treat the dowry carefully, but it also fostered tension. Men who resented their wives' families sometimes viewed the dowry as a burden rather than a gift, a constant reminder of debts owed. Communities, too, were entangled in these arrangements. In small villages, everyone knew the terms of a marriage contract. When disputes arose, neighbors testified in court about what had been promised, who had witnessed the exchange, and whether gifts were delivered. Marriages were not private affairs, they were community events, woven into the social fabric like the fields that bordered each farm. Even guilds and city councils took an interest. In urban centres like Florence, dowry funds were administered publicly, ensuring that daughters of citizens would not be left without prospects. These civic institutions treated dowries almost like investments, strengthening the economic stability of the city itself. It was understood that when citizens married securely, the entire community prospered. The scale of these arrangements could vary dramatically by region. In southern Europe, particularly Italy and Spain, dowries were often larger and more elaborate, reflecting the wealth of urban elites. In northern Europe, where inheritance customs sometimes favoured sons, dowries could be smaller, though still essential. In Scandinavia, traces of older traditions lingered, with bride prices playing a more prominent role. And in parts of Eastern Europe, both dowries and bride prices coexisted, creating a double burden that could stretch families thin. This variation reminds us that medieval marriage was never a single model. It shifted across regions, shaped by local economies, customs, and laws. Yet everywhere, the same principle held true: marriage was a contract, a binding exchange of resources, not simply an affair of the heart. The consequences of these contracts could ripple outward in surprising ways. For example, in times of war or famine, dowry disputes often increased. Families who had promised coin or land suddenly found themselves unable to pay, leading to broken betrothals or lawsuits. In plague years, the sudden death of a bride or groom could leave families wrangling over whether dowries should be returned. These disputes filled the records of city notaries, their dry language masking the grief and uncertainty that lay beneath. And then there were the cases where dowries shaped entire dynasties. Consider the marriage of Eleanor of Aquitaine to Henry II of England in the 12th century. Eleanor brought vast lands as her dowry, territories that would shape centuries of Anglo-French rivalry. Though her case was exceptional, it highlights a truth that applied even in the humblest village. Dowries were not just household matters. They were forces that reshaped political maps, social hierarchies, and economic fortunes. But perhaps most striking is how little voice many brides had in this process. The negotiations were conducted by fathers, uncles, or guardians, while the young woman herself often remained silent. In some cases, she was not even present when her future was decided. Her consent was expected, but her influence was limited. It was only after the contract was sealed that she stepped into the role assigned to her. And yet, silence does not mean absence. Some women learn to wield quiet influence, nudging fathers or brothers toward favorable matches. In rare cases, strong-willed brides refused to accept the arrangements made for them, running away, joining convents, or appealing to sympathetic priests. Their stories remind us that beneath the dull machinery of contracts, real human choices persisted, sometimes stubbornly so. Picture again that chamber where the contracts are signed. The bride stands quietly, perhaps clutching a small bundle of leniens that will form part of her dowry. Her father and future father-in-law shake hands. The notary scratches his pen across the parchment, and witnesses nod solemnly. Outside, life goes on. The marketplace hums, children chase geese through the mud, and the church bell tolls the passing hour. Yet in that cramped, candlelit space, the lives of two families have just been bound together in obligations that may endure for generations. It is a moment at once ordinary and profound, and so we are left with a thought: if medieval marriage was structured so heavily around property and contracts, did affection simply adapt to these terms, or did it struggle against them? Was love a luxury for the fortunate few, or a quiet presence that found its way even within the rigid lines of dowry registers and notarial ink? When the wedding feast ended, the candles sputtered low, and the guests stumbled home through the narrow lanes, the newlyweds were left to face not only each other, but also the weight of promises made in ink and parchment. For all the ceremony, it was the dowry and the marriage contract that lingered longest, shaping what their life together would look like in the months and years ahead. The most immediate impact was often practical. A bride might arrive at her new household with chests of linens, wool blankets, or copper pots, items that softened her daily life but also symbolized her family's investment in her new role. In wealthier homes, she might bring silver goblets, carved furniture, or embroidered hangings, which would decorate her new chambers and remind visitors of her family's standing. These objects became part of the household's rhythm. Blankets spread on beds, pots clattering by the fire, goblets passed from hand to hand during meals. But the less visible dowry items, coins, land deeds, or rights to rents, were the true foundation of married life. They determined how much grain could be sown, how many animals could be kept, how secure the family would feel when winter arrived. A generous dowry might mean a new roof, extra servants, or a second ox to pull the plough. A meager one might mean constant calculation: how much bread to bake, how much salt to buy, whether it was wiser to mend shoes one more time rather than replace them. Over time, these dowries and contracts also dictated inheritance. Sons expected to inherit land and tools, while daughters' marriages were prepared with careful attention to what their dowries would include. In many families, each marriage contract was like a link in a chain, binding one generation to the next. Parents who struggled to provide sufficient dowries sometimes turned to neighbors or monasteries for loans. Thus, a single wedding night could set into motion decades of financial balancing as one family worked to honor obligations to another. Dowries could even decide where children grew up. If a woman's dowry included land in a distant village, she and her husband might move there, uprooting themselves from familiar paths and neighbors. And when disputes arose, as they often did, children might be sent to live with relatives until matters were settled. What began as a parchment contract in candlelight could ripple outward into the very geography of family life. One cannot help but imagine the quieter domestic moments shaped by these contracts. A husband counting out the last of a dowry's coins, while his wife looks on, worried about the harvest. A wife carefully storing a bolt of cloth, knowing it came from her father's house. A pair of grandparents sitting by the fire, recalling how their own dowry disputes had been settled decades earlier. These details rarely appear in chronicles or legal records, yet they must have filled the days and nights of countless households. And still, the human element persisted. While money and property framed the marriage, affection and partnership found ways to grow. Some couples likely became close companions, united by the daily work of survival. Others may have remained distant, bound more to obligation than to fondness. A fortunate few perhaps found both financial stability and mutual warmth. But in all cases, the shadow of the dowry remained, a constant reminder of the families and promises standing behind them. It is worth noting that not all women accepted their lot quietly. In towns across Europe, legal records show wives insisting on the return of their dowries when husbands proved reckless or cruel. Widows, too, defended their right to reclaim their property, sometimes taking their sons-in-law or even powerful lords to court. The language of these petitions was formal, almost dull, yet beneath the polite words lay determination, even defiance. In a society that often confined women's voices, the dowry provided a narrow channel for assertion. Beyond individuals, these customs also shaped culture itself. Ballads, sermons, and satirical poems often poked fun at greedy in-laws, stingy fathers, or mismatched couples joined more by coin than by affection. Priests warned against avarice in marriage, urging parishioners to remember the spiritual union beneath the financial one. Yet even these warnings reveal how deeply economic concerns were tied to the idea of wedlock. To speak of marriage was, inevitably, to speak of dowries. Over centuries, the system evolved. By the late Middle Ages, cities such as Venice and Florence created public dowry funds, ensuring that even poorer families could provide something for their daughters. These funds were carefully managed, with interest accruing until the girl married. The result was an almost bureaucratic approach to marriage, a blending of civic finance and family life. It might sound impersonal, yet for countless women, these funds meant the difference between the security of marriage and the vulnerability of spinsterhood. And so, in the end, the wedding night was less about romance and more about structure. Beneath the candlelight and music, beneath the feast and laughter, lay a contract that determined not only where the couple slept that night, but how their children would live, how property would flow, and how disputes might unfold long after they themselves had passed on. The medieval world was nothing if not practical. Marriage was both a personal union and a public arrangement, a binding of hearts perhaps, but more certainly of purses, fields, and hearths. As we step away from these dimly lit chambers and parchment documents, one thought lingers: the wedding night, so often imagined in terms of romance, was for medieval families the first page in a long ledger, a record of duties and debts, comforts and conflicts, woven quietly into the fabric of everyday life. And with that, we bring this second story of contracts, dowries, and obligations to a close. 14th centuries, a time when wedding feasts stretched for hours, sometimes days, filling great halls with music, laughter, and the clatter of wooden trenchers. But when the merriment ended, the new couple found themselves facing not a storybook romance, but the very ordinary reality of the medieval wedding night. The candles have burned low in a timber-framed hall somewhere in northern France. The wedding feast has ended, the musicians have packed away their lutes and fiddles, and the air is thick with the smell of roasted meats, spilled oil, and smoke from the hearth. Guests stumble out into the night, murmuring farewells and laughing softly, while servants scrape trenches into buckets and sweep the rushes beneath the trestle tables. For much of the day, food and festivity have been the true focus. Weddings were not primarily about intimacy, but about community, and the feast was the proof of a family's ability to host and provide. A wealthy household might offer roasted swan, venison, or pies stuffed with spices from the east, while humbler families served coarse bread, ale, and salted pork. The scale of the meal often matched the size of the dowry. An abundant table was a public display of wealth, while a modest one was no less heartfelt but more restrained. These meals could stretch on, course after course, with musicians weaving songs between dishes and priests offering blessings between goblets of wine. People talked of trade and crops, of neighbors and distant battles. In some villages, guests joined in singing old ballads, clapping along while children danced at the edges of the hall. The feast was a ritual of inclusion. Everyone had a place, everyone was meant to witness the union. But when the last dish was cleared, the focus shifted to something quieter, the movement of the bride and groom toward their chamber. It was here that the rituals grew both solemn and awkward. In some places, guests followed the couple to their room, carrying candles and chanting blessings. In others, the couple was led in private, the household hushed, while elders murmured prayers outside the door. Sometimes clergy were present to bless the bed, sprinkling holy water on the linens and praying for fertility. Imagine standing in that chamber, a wooden bedstead with ropes, stretched beneath a straw mattress, sheets that may or may not have been freshly washed, and a heavy wool blanket folded at the foot. If the family was wealthy, embroidered hangings might surround the bed, painted with scenes of saints or animals. In poorer homes, the chamber might be little more than a corner curtained off from the rest of the house. The first moments of quiet after the feast must have felt stark. Outside, laughter faded. Inside, the smell of the feast lingered on clothing, on hair, on the air itself. And while popular imagination often imagines romance, for many medieval couples, the night was more about ritual than passion. Some were strangers to each other, having spoken only briefly before the wedding. Others were familiar but still reserved, suddenly alone for the first time. And there, in the hush, the true wedding began, not the one witnessed in the church, nor the one celebrated at the table, but the one carried out between two individuals, with the expectations of families, neighbors, and even the church pressing in through the silence. The feast was finished, the guests were gone, and the chamber door closed. But what really happened in those long, quiet hours? Did couples talk, awkwardly sharing their first real words alone? Did they rush to complete the duty expected of them, hoping to settle the matter before exhaustion overtook them? Or did some simply fall asleep, too tired from the endless hours of ritual and celebration to think of anything else? And so we pause here, at the edge of that chamber, with only dim light and tired footsteps to guide us further. The chamber was not always as private as we might imagine. In many parts of medieval Europe, the so-called bedding ceremony was treated almost as an extension of the feast. Relatives and close companions might escort the bride and groom to their room, laughing and teasing, sometimes even tossing them onto the bed as a form of symbolic encouragement. In noble households, the spectacle could become ceremonial. The couple was undressed not in solitude, but in the presence of attendants, who laid out their nightclothes, folded their wedding garments, and whispered prayers as they slipped into bed. The reasoning was practical as well as symbolic. Marriage was not simply personal, it was a contract, a binding of families, and the consummation of the union was legally significant. In some cases, witnesses lingered near the chamber door, waiting to hear some proof, whether in sound or testimony, that the union had been sealed. While modern sensibilities recoil at the idea, medieval communities viewed the couple's intimacy as a public matter, one that confirmed the validity of the marriage and its potential to produce heirs. For many couples, however, reality was far more ordinary. The bedding ceremony might end with a door closed, and after hours of feasting and drinking, exhaustion outweighed any sense of urgency. Some likely fell into bed with little more than a muttered goodnight. Others may have shared quiet words, nervous laughter, or hesitant gestures, testing the edges of an unfamiliar closeness. In arranged marriages, especially among the young, shyness prevailed. A bride of 14 or 15 might sit silently, staring at the rush-strewn floor, while her husband, often older, searched for words to bridge the distance. Even the bed itself told part of the story. Wealthier families prepared embroidered linens, symbols of prosperity and cleanliness. For peasants, bedding was more practical: a straw mattress, rough linen sheets, and a heavy blanket to fight off the chill. Some slept in a room where other family members also resided, divided only by a curtain or a screen. Privacy, in the strict sense, was rare. The church, too, loomed over the night. Priests had long emphasized that intimacy within marriage was both duty and blessing. Fertility was prized, for children were laborers, heirs, and carriers of family memory. In sermons, clerics warned couples against sinful lust, yet urged them to fulfill their obligations. This contradiction created an atmosphere in which the wedding night was not just personal, but theological. The bed was at once a place of quiet union and a stage upon which divine expectation played its part. Yet for all the talk of duty, human hesitation often intervened. Letters and chronicles occasionally hint that couples delayed consummation for days, even weeks, whether from nerves, illness, or simple disinterest. The law might require proof of consummation for inheritance disputes, but everyday life rarely unfolded according to rigid rules. Much like today, individuals found their own rhythms, balancing family pressure with personal readiness. And what of love? Romantic attachment, though not absent, was rarely the priority in a medieval marriage. Unions were built on land, alliances and dowries, not on affection. Still, in the hushed hours of a wedding night, something more intimate could stir. Some couples spoke of a gentle familiarity, a kindness that grew in the quiet darkness. For others, awkwardness lingered, the weight of expectation pressing down on tired shoulders. The reality was varied, shaped by personality, upbringing, and circumstance. There were also stories, half humorous, half cautionary, told by chroniclers of wedding nights gone wrong. A noble groom too drunk to rise from the bench. A timid bride who refused to leave the chamber door. A couple whose bed collapsed beneath them, sending servants into laughter. Such tales remind us that the night was not always solemn. It was human, filled with stumbles as well as ritual. And so, in the stillness after the feast, a medieval couple found themselves balancing on the line between tradition and personal reality. For some, the night carried the full weight of expectation, a moment of consummation required and recorded. For others, it was nothing more than the first of many shared silences, awkward but survivable, soon folded into the ordinary rhythms of life. But even after this first night, questions remained. Did the act of sharing a bed create real intimacy? Or did it only cement a contract already decided? Could affection grow in the shadow of duty? Or was love something secondary, arriving later if it arrived at all? The morning after a wedding was not left entirely to the couple's privacy. In noble households, servants entered early, bringing food, washing water, or clothing. The marriage bed was often examined, not only to ensure linens were cared for but, in some cases, to look for signs of consummation. It was an uncomfortable intrusion by modern standards, yet in the medieval mind, such scrutiny was practical. Marriage was a legal bond with implications for inheritance, property, and the continuity of bloodlines. Evidence mattered. In village life, proof might come in less formal ways. Neighbors gossiped, friends teased, and mothers whispered questions to their daughters. The first days of marriage were subject to observation, and any hint of discord became fuel for rumor. A bride who seemed withdrawn or a groom who boasted too loudly might find themselves the subject of speculation at the market. Privacy, once again, was rare. After the feast and the first night, daily life began almost immediately. For peasants, the return to labor was swift. The newly bride might rise to help with milking cows or grinding grain, while the groom returned to tending fields or repairing tools. The union was not an escape from work, but a reorganization of it. Two households were now one, and each partner's labor fed into the same hearth. For wealthier couples, responsibilities took a different form, managing estates, overseeing servants, or attending to the politics of kinship alliances. It is striking how quickly the extraordinary slipped into the ordinary. The candlelight and music of the feast gave way to the routine of meals, chores, and obligations. Husbands and wives adjusted to one another not in the chamber alone, but at the table, in the fields, and beside the hearth. Affection grew, if it did, through these repeated moments of shared life. The wedding night was less an ending, or beginning than a hinge, marking a shift from anticipation to the unromantic constancy of living together. Yet expectations lingered. Families waited for news of pregnancy, often with impatience. A bride's worth, in many eyes, was tied to her ability to bear children. If months passed without signs of fertility, questions arose, and remedies, herbal, spiritual, or medical, were sought. Some women faced pressure from mothers, in-law, or whispers from neighbors, bearing the weight of responsibility for a household's future. For men, too, failure carried consequences, though discussions of male infertility were often cloaked in silence or blame shifting. Among the nobility, this matter was even more charged. The production of heirs was critical, for without them, dynastic claims faltered, and lands could slip away through disputes. Chroniclers recorded with interest the births, or lack thereof, within great houses. A failed consummation could lead to annulments, accusations, or political upheaval. Thus, what began in the quiet chamber could ripple outward into the larger affairs of kingdoms. Despite such weighty concerns, not every marriage was burdened by tension. Many couples grew accustomed to one another in time, forming bonds of companionship, if not always passion. Letters from later centuries suggest that tenderness did emerge, even in unions begun without love. Shared hardship, mutual labor, and the raising of children created ties that could not easily be measured at the outset. The wedding night was remembered less for its awkwardness than for its role as a threshold, the point at which two separate lives merged into one. But not all unions prospered. Some marriages remained strained, marked by distance, conflict, or silence. The wedding night, instead of ushering in closeness, might reinforce a sense of alienation. Chroniclers rarely preserved these quieter tragedies, but archaeology and court records hint at the fractures that could emerge: broken households, abandoned spouses, or accusations of cruelty. Marriage was, after all, a binding contract, one not easily escaped, regardless of personal happiness. If we return to the chamber, imagining the couple in those first hours, it becomes clear that the reality was far from uniform. Some laughed, some wept, some said nothing at all. The bedding ceremony, the feast, the rituals, all these were scaffolding around an experience that was deeply human, marked by uncertainty and imperfection. The first night was rarely the romantic pinnacle we imagine today. It was a passage into something larger, something enduring, and often something far more complicated. And as the days turned into months, the meaning of that first night changed. For some, it was the beginning of a life of partnership. For others, it was the start of struggle. Yet all carried the imprint of expectation, ritual, and community, a reminder that even in the quietest moments, medieval life was never entirely private. So we might ask, when two people lay down together on that first night, surrounded by centuries of custom and the eyes of family and faith, did they feel the weight of history upon them, or simply the silence of a shared bed, uncertain of what came next? 12th and 13th centuries, a time when marriages among noble families were rarely about love and far more about politics, wealth, and survival. The wedding night was less about two hearts meeting than about binding entire bloodlines together. Some nights were filled with ritual, others with silence, and many with obligations that reached far beyond the chamber walls. The marriage you are about to witness is not the union of two lovers, but the sealing of a contract. The bride may be a girl of 12 or 14, the groom a man much older. Their match was decided by fathers, uncles, or even kings, calculated for advantage. The bride's dowry might include land, coin, or livestock, while the groom's family offered status and protection. For both, the wedding night was less a private milestone than a public expectation to prove the union legitimate and, in time, fruitful. The feast leading up to this moment was grand. Long trestle tables filled the hall, heavy with roasted meats, stews, and spiced wine. Musicians played, dogs lingered near the benches, and servants hurried with trenchers of bread. Toasts were raised, gifts exchanged, and lords spoke of alliances. Yet as the torches burned low, the chatter shifted. The company knew the couple must soon retire. This was the true purpose of the gathering. The chamber was prepared with care. Rich fabrics covered the bed, wool, linen, sometimes even silks if the family's wealth allowed. A fire burned in the hearth. In some traditions, witnesses escorted the couple to the room, offering blessings and ribald jokes alike. At times, the bed itself was blessed by a priest, who sprinkled holy water over the sheets. All was designed to emphasize not romance but legitimacy, the sense that this night was both sacred and binding. For the young bride, the experience could be daunting. She may have spent her childhood in her father's hall, surrounded by familiar kin, only to find herself now in a foreign household, married to a man she scarcely knew. The groom, for his part, might feel the burden of expectation heavy upon him. His family, his lands, and even his lineage demanded that this night succeed. The couple lay down together, and while we cannot know the words they spoke, it is unlikely they matched our modern imaginings of love. They may have discussed households, estates, or duties. Or they may have said nothing at all, the silence carrying the weight of obligation. This was less the joining of two individuals than the merging of dynasties. As you picture this chamber, with its flickering firelight and hushed air, you can almost feel the distance between the grand celebration outside and the quiet uncertainty within. For many couples, the wedding night was not the culmination of romance, but the beginning of adjustment, an uneasy step into roles neither had chosen. And yet, beneath the weight of politics and duty, one question lingers. When the door finally closed and the revelry faded into the distance, did these two young people find even a flicker of genuine connection in the quiet of that night? When dawn crept through the narrow window slits of a noble chamber, the wedding night did not simply vanish into memory. Instead, the household awaited its outcome. A chamberlain or attendant might gather the bed linens as evidence of consummation, displaying them discreetly, or sometimes not so discreetly, to affirm the union. In many noble courts, this was not a matter of privacy but of proof. A marriage unconsummated could be annulled, and lands, dowries, and political alliances could unravel. It is strange to imagine today, but the intimacy of two individuals could determine the stability of entire lordships. A failed consummation might spark disputes between families, cause treaties to falter, or invite rivals to press claims. In this way, the wedding night was not only personal, it was profoundly political. After the chamber ritual, life settled into new rhythms. For the bride, this often meant learning the customs of her husband's household. She might be expected to oversee servants, manage the storerooms, or adjust to a new dialect or regional tradition. For young women married into powerful houses, the task was daunting. They were strangers among retainers loyal to their husband's lineage. The groom, meanwhile, faced the expectations of producing heirs. It was not merely hoped for, it was demanded. Chroniclers and family elders often calculated how quickly children were born after the marriage, for a swift pregnancy was seen as a sign of both health and divine favor. Each passing month without news of conception could stir whispers in the hallways, glances at meals, or private concerns voiced between advisors. Not every couple found misery in these arrangements. Some grew into quiet companionship. Letters between medieval nobles occasionally reveal tenderness. Expressions of longing when husbands traveled on campaigns or wives returned to their natal families. Over time, shared responsibilities, managing estates, raising children, surviving the hazards of medieval life, could forge bonds deeper than those first awkward nights. Yet others lived in estrangement. Age gaps were common, and affection was not guaranteed. Some marriages, while legally secure, remained emotionally barren. For noblewomen, their worth was often measured by fertility. For noblemen, by the alliances and heirs secured. It was a narrow frame through which lives unfolded, dictated less by desire than by dynastic necessity. To imagine the quiet mornings after, Consider the small, unremarkable details: the bride rising early to hear mass, the groom discussing land holdings with stewards, the slow weaving of two lives into the fabric of a larger household. It was in these moments, rather than in the ceremonies, that the true work of marriage began. But lingering always was the question that stretched beyond the wedding night itself: would this union, arranged by families and cemented by ritual, truly fulfill its purpose of producing heirs and strengthening alliances? Or would it falter under the weight of unmet expectations? If the medieval wedding night was heavy with expectation, the years that followed revealed whether those expectations bore fruit. For noble couples, success was measured most plainly in the birth of heirs. A son, especially, confirmed the continuation of a lineage, ensuring estates and titles would remain intact. Daughters, too, held their value, bridges to future alliances, pawns in the slow and careful game of diplomacy. The household celebrated births with bells and prayers, feasts and offerings at the parish church. Yet the joy of survival was shadowed by risk. Childbirth was perilous for women, and infant mortality remained painfully high. For every child celebrated, another might be buried within weeks. Marriage, though arranged for dynastic gain, was lived in the fragile rhythms of hope and loss. Dynastic unions could strengthen kingdoms, but they could also ignite conflict. Consider the case of Margaret of Anjou, married to Henry VI of England in the mid-15th century. Their union was intended to cement peace between England and France, yet it became one thread in the tangled Wars of the Roses. A single night, meant to seal peace, instead became the root of decades of civil strife. Elsewhere, marriages stitched together lands that might never otherwise have shared a ruler. The Habsburg dynasty perfected this strategy. Through careful unions, often consummated under watchful eyes, they expanded their dominions across Europe. Their family motto could have been said to echo the very purpose of those first nights together: let others wage war, you, happy Austria, marry. But not every arranged match fulfilled its political promise. When consummation was doubted, or when heirs failed to appear, alliances unraveled. Disputes arose over dowries, inheritance claims, or the legitimacy of children. Annulments were sought on grounds of non-consummation, tearing apart bonds meant to last a lifetime. In some cases, entire wars began over the failure of two people to produce an heir. The fate of empires turned on the quiet question of what did, or did not, happen in the bedchamber. And yet, behind these dynastic calculations, we must remember the individuals themselves. Some couples endured these expectations with wary resignation, others discovered companionship amid duty. Though their unions were arranged, their lives unfolded in all the ordinary human ways. Shared meals, whispered concerns, the raising of children, and the struggles of daily survival. The medieval wedding night, so often shrouded in ritual and scrutiny, was but the beginning. From that point forward, the marriage became not just a contract between families, but the lived reality of two people navigating power, faith, and fragile human existence. So, as we close this story, consider how a single night, arranged, supervised, and recorded, could alter the destinies of families, kingdoms, and dynasties. When viewed from afar, the wedding night was never merely private. It was a hinge upon which the doors of history swung, quietly shaping the course of Europe. In medieval ages, when most people lived not as lords or ladies, but as peasants bound to land, artisans in crowded towns, or laborers trying to make ends meet, the wedding nights of these men and women were not marked by trumpets, witnesses, or dynastic treaties, but by simple rituals, local customs, and the everyday realities of shared life. The late 1200s. The sun has barely risen over the thatched rooftops, and a small village is already stirring. Chickens scratch in the yard, a dog barks at the edge of the field, and smoke curls slowly upward from the chimneys. In this world, the majority of weddings were not grand affairs, but modest community events, and the wedding night, though private in theory, was deeply shaped by the traditions of village life. For peasants and laborers, marriage itself was both a social necessity and a practical arrangement. A man and woman united not merely out of affection, though love sometimes played its part, but because two pairs of hands could work more effectively than one. The union meant help with ploughing, harvesting, cooking, and raising children. It meant survival through winter, when food stores ran low and illness prowled silently through the cold. The wedding feast, even for the poor, was an occasion for celebration. Families pooled resources to provide bread, perhaps some pork or fish, and in rare moments of prosperity, a touch of honeyed cake. Music might be played by local fiddlers or flutes carved from reeds. Guests crowded into small, smoky halls or, in summer, gathered outdoors. The merriment could last hours, sometimes even spilling into the next day. But as laughter faded and guests drifted home, the newly married couple faced the transition from public joy to private union. For noble families, as we have seen, this might involve formal witnesses. For commoners, the rituals were simpler, though no less meaningful. In many villages, the newlyweds were escorted from the feast to their chamber in a small procession, neighbors teasing them with playful songs or light-hearted jokes. The bed itself was rarely luxurious. In a peasant's cottage, it might be a wooden frame with straw-filled mattresses, perhaps softened by woolen blankets if the family was fortunate. Privacy was scarce. In small homes, parents, siblings, and sometimes servants all shared the same roof, separated only by thin partitions, if at all. A curtain hung around a bed might have been the only barrier between the couple and the rest of the household. The act of consummation, though deeply personal, was still bound to communal expectations. Everyone knew why the marriage bed mattered. It legitimized the union in the eyes of the community, the church, and eventually the children who would carry on the family's labor and name. Not every village treated the matter solemnly. In some parts of Europe, playful customs blurred the line between celebration and intrusion. Newlyweds might find their chamber door rattled by neighbors demanding a bridal, a small payment of drink or coin, before they were left in peace. In other places, mischievous youths tied pots and pans together, banging them outside the cottage in a noisy ritual, sometimes called a charivari. It was a way of both acknowledging and teasing the couple as they stepped into married life. The church, however, urged seriousness. Priests reminded couples that their union was a sacrament ordained by God, and consummation was its sacred seal. Sin, they warned, lurked in lustful excess. Moderation, fidelity, and the goal of children framed the church's vision of the marriage bed. And yet, in cottages across Europe, couples navigated these expectations in their own quiet ways. Imagine the flickering light of a tallow candle casting shadows against the wooden beams. The air is cool, scented with smoke from the hearth. The village outside has gone still, save for the occasional bark of a dog or the distant hoot of an owl. Within that small room, amid straw bedding and woolen cloth, two people begin their life together, perhaps nervous, perhaps shy, perhaps simply exhausted from the day's celebration. And so, for peasants and common folk, the wedding night was not about dynasties or treaties, but about forming the bond that would carry them through seasons of work, hardship, and survival. But what happened when communities, or even churches, began to interfere more directly, imposing rules on how these nights should unfold, and even questioning whether a marriage was valid without witnesses or proof? The wedding night of peasants and townsfolk may have taken place in a small, smoke-darkened cottage or an upstairs room above a noisy inn. But even these modest beginnings were not free from the weight of outside judgment. What unfolded between two people in the straw and wool of their bed could, strangely enough, become a matter of law, religion, and community scrutiny. Marriage in the Middle Ages was not only a personal vow, it was also a public contract. The church taught that the moment a man and woman exchanged vows in the present tense, "I take you as my husband, I take you as my wife," they were bound before God. Yet consummation gave the bond its physical seal, and in disputes over inheritance, legitimacy, or scandal, this detail could become vitally important. In villages across Europe, gossip carried weight. If a bride was known to enter marriage without her maidenhood, whispers could spread quickly. Neighbors remembered everything: who had walked home with whom, who had been seen lingering near barns or fields, who had shared a mug of ale too warmly at the tavern. These whispers mattered, for they could later be brought before church courts, where witnesses might testify about the character and reputation of a bride or groom. Church courts heard countless cases concerning whether a marriage had been validly contracted or properly consummated. Some involved couples who later regretted their vows, others families disputing property or inheritance. Testimonies could reach into the most intimate details. Women might be questioned about whether the marriage bed had been joined in flesh. Men, too, faced inquiries into whether they were able in body to complete their role. The private act of consummation was never entirely private in a society where community and church both felt entitled to pass judgment. The common folk often tried to shield themselves with rituals of proof. In some towns, witnesses would linger outside the chamber, listening for signs that the union had taken place. In rural communities, bedding ceremonies could ensure there were enough people to swear later that the couple had indeed been left together in the same bed. This was less about prying curiosity and more about protecting the legitimacy of children and the inheritance of property, however small that property might be. A peasant family might own nothing more than a strip of land, a cow, or a collection of tools, but the right to pass these on without dispute mattered greatly. Thus, the first night of a marriage became not only a symbol of love, but also a legal safeguard. For women, the expectations were complex. They were urged to enter marriage chaste, to demonstrate modesty, and to bear children faithfully. Yet in practice, many women brought knowledge of intimacy into the marriage bed, whether through whispered conversations with older women, or because premarital relationships had been more common than church officials wished to admit. Village culture could be lenient in this regard, recognizing that young people who worked, played, and lived side by side often formed attachments long before the priest gave his blessing. For men, the night often carried the burden of performance. Failure to consummate could bring shame not only upon the groom, but upon his entire family. Remedies for such failures ranged from folk medicine to the intervention of church courts, which sometimes subjected men to humiliating examinations to determine their potency. The church insisted that the goal of intimacy was procreation, not pleasure. Manuals of confession warned against acts considered excessive or unnatural, though how closely these rules were followed in the privacy of the home remains beyond our knowledge. In reality, couples likely balanced church teaching with the practical rhythms of their own lives. Nights of closeness were shaped by fatigue from farm labor, the demands of seasonal work, the noise of children, or the thinness of walls that offered little privacy. In towns, artisans and laborers faced additional pressures. Journeymen might marry later in life, after years of saving enough to support a household. Their wedding nights took place not in sprawling estates, but in rented rooms above shops, or in the back of workshops where tools and beds shared the same narrow space. The creak of floorboards, the smell of dye vats or tanned leather, the muffled noise of the street below. All these framed the intimacy of urban marriages. What becomes striking is how much community involvement surrounded what we today might think of as entirely private, whether through teasing songs, ritual processions, or the ever-present eye of neighbors and priests. Medieval couples could not fully escape the gaze of others. Their wedding nights were entangled with law, gossip, and tradition, and yet, beneath all of these structures, the reality was often simpler. Two people, nervous or wary, making the first step toward building a household. The straw mattress may have been uncomfortable, the blankets rough, the air heavy with smoke from the hearth. But for the newlyweds it marked the beginning of their shared life. But what happened when things went wrong? When a marriage was never consummated? When impotence was alleged? Or when a bride's chastity was called into question? These disputes could drag the most private matters into the cold light of public judgment. Not every marriage began smoothly. For all the songs, rituals, and communal approval, there were occasions when the first night ended in silence, unease, or outright failure. These were the moments when what should have been the most private aspect of a union suddenly became the subject of public debate. One of the most common disputes revolved around non-consummation. When a marriage was said not to have been sealed by flesh, questions arose. Was the husband physically incapable? Was the bride unwilling, or perhaps already attached to someone else? Such matters were not left to the couple alone. Families, priests, and even judges of the church could become involved. Church courts in the Middle Ages developed elaborate ways of handling these cases. If a bride claimed her husband was impotent, he might be subjected to a public examination. In some instances, respected older women were appointed to inspect the man's body and report on whether he was able in nature. Humiliating though this sounds, it reflects how seriously society took the link between consummation, legitimacy, and inheritance. There are records of men being ordered to attempt consummation under observation, with witnesses stationed outside the chamber to testify whether the union was successful. The couple's private struggle thus became a public performance, reduced to proof of soundness for the sake of law and property. Women, too, could find themselves accused. If a husband alleged that his wife was not a virgin at the time of marriage, her honor and her family's reputation could be placed on trial. Some towns preserved lurid rituals where a blood-stained sheet was displayed after the wedding night, meant to silence doubts about chastity. But in reality, biology is inconsistent, and failure to produce such a sign could have dire social consequences. When questions of virginity arose, witnesses might be called, neighbors who remembered seeing the bride walking with another man, midwives who claimed to know the signs of innocence or experience, even former suitors who might testify to prior encounters. Such trials could stretch on for months, with the church seeking truth in matters that no outsider could ever truly confirm. Beyond legal disputes, there were the quieter tragedies, marriages that began without affection, couples bound by arrangement rather than choice. A bride might feel fear more than joy as she was led to her husband's bed. A groom might struggle under the pressure of proving himself on the first night. These realities remind us that medieval weddings were less about romance than about alliances, work, and survival. Yet, not all was bleak. For many couples, the bedding was less dramatic than church manuals or court records suggest. They may have laughed at the teasing songs of their friends, accepted the cup of ale brought to their bedside, and then, once alone, simply begun the slow process of learning to live together. The rhythms of daily life quickly overtook the ceremonial weight of the first night. Soon, the concerns of the couple turned toward planting fields, tending livestock, or learning the craft of a household. Intimacy, in this sense, became less about proving an act, and more about forging companionship through shared labor. Still, the looming possibility of scrutiny never entirely disappeared. Should the couple fail to produce children within a few years, tongues might wag again. Was the marriage truly consummated? Was one partner barren? Were there hidden sins preventing the blessing of fertility? Such questions, however uncomfortable, show how deeply marriage was entangled with the expectations of the community. So the wedding night of common folk was never entirely their own. It carried with it the hopes of families, the weight of tradition, and sometimes the intrusions of law. And yet, in the flicker of lamplight, on a bed of straw or a pallet of wool, couples found ways to begin. Whether through awkwardness, tenderness, or endurance, they started the work of turning ceremony into daily life. And this leads us to a broader reflection. When so much of marriage was shaped by community oversight, how much space was truly left for privacy? Could medieval couples ever claim a night as theirs alone? Or was the weight of the village, the priest, and the law always present in their most intimate moments? In the grand stone halls of Europe's castles, the wedding night of nobles was less about romance and far more about politics, ceremony, and the delicate web of alliances that tied kingdoms together. While common villagers might celebrate marriages with rustic songs and shared cups of ale, the upper ranks of medieval society faced an entirely different kind of pressure: the knowledge that their first night together could shape dynasties, determine peace or war, and decide the fate of entire lands. For noble couples, marriage was rarely a matter of affection. Instead, it was a carefully calculated arrangement, negotiated by fathers, uncles, and political advisors who weighed dowries inheritances, and loyalties. A wedding was less a union of two individuals than of two lineages. The wedding night, therefore, carried symbolic weight far beyond what the couple themselves might have wished. When the feast ended, often after days of celebration, the noble bride and groom were led to their chamber in a procession that mixed solemnity with jest. Courtiers, musicians, and sometimes even clergy escorted the couple to the threshold of the bedchamber. The bedding ceremony, a fixture among nobles, was more elaborate than anything villagers experienced. Ladies in waiting helped the bride out of her layers of silk, velvet, and brocade, garments often embroidered with gold thread. Her hair, unbound for the first time, symbolized virginity and transition into womanhood. The groom, too, was often dressed in ceremonial attire, which attendants carefully removed as he prepared for bed. The room itself might be lavishly decorated. Tapestries depicting biblical scenes or family heraldry hung upon the walls, a large bed raised on a platform draped with fine linens, and candles burning steadily, casting long shadows against carved stone. Unlike among peasants, the bedding of nobles was often witnessed by many. High-ranking guests might remain in the chamber, at least for the formal part, offering blessings or even ribald jokes meant to ease tension. In some traditions, bishops or priests spoke prayers over the bed, asking for fertility and the health of heirs. The symbolism was clear. The marriage was not only between two people, but a public pact watched over by God, family, and the realm itself. The expectation of consummation was intense. In a noble household, a child born of the marriage was not just a personal joy. It was the essential guarantee of succession. Without legitimate heirs, disputes could tear a realm apart. The memory of past civil wars, caused by unclear inheritance, made families and lords deeply invested in what took place behind those heavy wooden doors. Yet we must remember the human side of this ritual. Many noble brides were still very young, sometimes in their early teens, married to older men who had already fought battles or held lands. The strangeness of the occasion, the coldness of stone chambers, and the pressure of expectation weighed heavily on them. For the groom, too, the night could be daunting. He might be under scrutiny not only from his household, but from the political rivals who would whisper about his strength or weakness. The tension between ceremony and intimacy defined the noble wedding night. On the one hand, it was carefully staged as a political moment. On the other, it was the beginning of two people learning how, or if, they could trust one another. The candles burned down, the courtiers withdrew, and finally the heavy door was closed. In that silence, behind the pageantry, the noble couple faced the same awkwardness as any other. The simple question of how to begin. But how often did these unions lead to true affection? And how often were they simply endured for duty's sake? And in the shadowed quiet of a castle chamber, could love ever grow beneath the crushing weight of politics? The noble wedding night was never only a private event. In fact, it was often carefully documented, remembered, and sometimes even disputed in years to come. For powerful families, the consummation of a marriage had far-reaching consequences. A legitimate heir depended on it, treaties depended on it, and in many cases, the peace between rival houses depended on it. The question of proof became central. In some regions of Europe, it was not enough for the couple to enter the chamber together. Evidence was expected. This might come in the form of blood-stained linens, displayed the following day, or sworn testimonies from servants who stood outside the chamber doors. While such practices varied widely, they reveal just how public the supposedly private union of nobles could be. What for ordinary villagers might have been a night of awkward beginnings became, for nobles, a spectacle tied to power and legitimacy. One of the most striking aspects of these bedding customs was how they reflected wider medieval concerns about inheritance and property. In a society where land was the principal measure of wealth, knowing exactly who could inherit that land mattered enormously. A noble marriage joined not just two people but two estates. Fields, castles, and rights to tolls or markets all hung in the balance. For this reason, families sought certainty that the union had been sealed. When disputes arose, they could grow into serious conflicts. Chronicles record marriages annulled on grounds of non-consummation, sometimes many years after the wedding itself. A noblewoman might be accused of failing to produce an heir, or a man might be accused of impotence, both charges carrying enormous shame. Physicians and church officials were sometimes called to examine couples in humiliating detail. In this way, the bedroom was drawn into the realm of law, politics, and church oversight. Still, beyond these formalities, there were moments of tenderness. Letters from later centuries, when nobles sometimes kept personal correspondence, suggest that some couples did grow close over time. While the first night may have been marked by nervousness, over weeks and months bonds could form. Shared meals, shared chapels, and shared duties within the household slowly wove threads of connection. It is also important to remember that noblewomen were not entirely without agency. Though many were young, and though their marriages were arranged, they often held considerable influence within their households. A noble bride might bring a significant dowry, making her valuable in negotiations. Once married, she oversaw servants, kitchens, and estates, and could wield soft power in court politics. In such settings, the wedding night was not simply about submission, but also about the beginning of a new role. Yet the tension never fully disappeared. The heavy expectations of heirs and alliances lingered in every noble chamber. Even when affection grew, duty remained. If years passed without children, whispers spread quickly, and pressure mounted. Some marriages fractured under the weight, while others endured quietly, the couple maintaining the appearance of unity for the sake of their families. And so, the noble wedding night occupied an unusual space, half ceremony, half private encounter. To the outside world, it was a declaration that the union was valid. To the couple themselves, it was the threshold of an uncertain partnership, sometimes warm, sometimes cold, always shadowed by duty. But as we imagine these moments, we must ask, what happened when expectation collided with reality? When a groom could not perform, or when a bride resisted, how did families, courts, and kingdoms respond? By the late Middle Ages, the noble wedding night had become more than a personal milestone. It was often the pivot on which dynasties turned. Behind the thick stone walls of castles, the first hours of a marriage could ripple outward, shaping treaties, inheritance, and even the course of kingdoms. One of the clearest examples lies in the many disputes over succession that erupted when marriages failed to produce heirs. If a noblewoman bore no children, whispers spread. Was the fault hers or her husband's? The church often became involved in these delicate matters, as canon law had strict rules about annulment. A union could be declared invalid if it had never been consummated, a fact that might be used decades after the wedding as political leverage. What had seemed like a private disappointment in the bridal chamber could later be wielded as a weapon in court. Such cases were not rare. In 12th and 13th century France, royal marriages were occasionally undone under precisely these terms. Chroniclers recorded humiliating trials where men and women were called to defend their ability to perform the most intimate act. Physicians, clerics, and witnesses debated matters that today would seem unthinkably private. The couple's linens, their personal statements, and even public inspections might all be drawn into evidence. This intrusion of politics into the bedroom reveals the immense weight placed on reproduction. For nobles, children were not just a joy or a legacy. They were a guarantee of stability. An heir meant the estate would pass smoothly, alliances would hold, and rival claimants could be set aside. A failure in this duty could unleash rivalries that had been simmering for generations. Consider too the role of dynastic alliances. Many noble unions were designed to seal peace between long feuding families. The first night together symbolized the hope of new beginnings. If harmony failed in the chamber, it sometimes foreshadowed difficulties in the broader political union. Chronicles occasionally note how marriages that began in discord led to renewed hostilities within a generation. Yet alongside these heavy expectations, there are glimpses of humanity. Not every noble wedding night ended in scrutiny or scandal. Some couples, once strangers, slowly learned companionship. Their letters, when preserved, speak of trust, affection, and shared burdens. Even under the weight of dynastic duty, individuals sometimes carved out genuine partnerships, shaping not only their estates but also the lives of those who served them. As the centuries progressed, the symbolism of the wedding night did not fade. Instead, it became layered with stories, rumors, and rituals that reflected each culture's anxieties and hopes. In England, France, and the Holy Roman Empire, nobles lived with the awareness that their first night was not theirs alone. Generations of vassals, tenants, and courtiers all had a stake in whether a child would one day inherit their lord's lands. Thus, the noble wedding night was never a simple moment of intimacy. It was a performance of continuity, a seal on contracts written long before the bride and groom had ever met. It carried with it the burden of entire lineages, and in this way it was both deeply personal and utterly public, a paradox that defined much of noble life. And so, we are left with the lingering question when stone castles echoed with silence after the feasts had ended, did the young couples inside those chambers think of their own lives first, or of the generations waiting outside their door? This time, we'll step into the humble cottages of peasants, far from the castles and courts, to see what wedding nights looked like for ordinary folk. No crowns, no dynasties, just people living close to the earth, with customs shaped by poverty, community, and survival. The year 2050, in a small rural village tucked somewhere in northern Europe. The cottage you find yourself in is simple, built from wattle and daub, with a thatched roof overhead and only 1 or 2 rooms inside. The walls smell faintly of smoke, since most houses lack chimneys, and the air is heavy with the scent of earth and animals. In one corner, straw is piled high for bedding. In another, tools hang from pegs, ready for the next day's work. It's not luxurious, but for peasants, this is home. The wedding feast ended earlier in the evening, and while the gentry might drink until dawn, the peasant celebration is shorter, less extravagant, though no less lively. Bread, cheese, and perhaps a bit of pork marked the meal, and neighbours danced until their legs gave out on the packed earth floor. Yet when the music fades, the new couple's first night together begins not in secrecy, but within the thin walls of a house where parents, siblings, or even servants may also sleep. Privacy, for peasants, is a luxury. That lack of privacy shaped the experience. Unlike noble couples, peasants rarely had chambers of their own. More often, they shared space with family or even livestock, separated only by wooden partitions or hanging cloth. This meant the wedding night could be quiet, tentative, or even delayed until the household settled into sleep. Some couples were used to this. They had grown up in crowded houses where every cough, snore, or whisper was overheard. Still, the moment carried meaning. The rituals were modest. A bride might be escorted to bed by a few female relatives, her hair let down from its braids to signal her new role as wife. Sometimes, a symbolic blessing was spoken, or a simple prayer said aloud, asking for fertility and good fortune. Then, with little ceremony, she and her husband lay down together, often in the same bedding they would use for the rest of their married life. The straw mattress, stuffed with hay, rushes, or wool scraps, was not soft by modern standards. It smelled of the fields and creaked when either person shifted. Blankets might be made of rough wool, heavy enough to block the cold, but scratchy on bare skin. Candles or oil lamps were expensive, so the cottage would be dark, lit only by the faint glow of embers from the hearth. But beneath the surface, this night carried enormous weight. For peasants, a marriage was not just a bond between two people. It was an agreement between families, and often between whole households. A union might mean merging farmland, combining tools, or sharing labor. The children born of the marriage would be future workers, able to till fields or tend herds. Survival depended on these practical matters. In this sense, the peasant wedding night was less about romance and more about continuity. Just as nobles carried the burden of dynasty, peasants carried the burden of survival. If the union did not produce children, the household would feel the strain. If a wife died young, the husband might remarry within weeks, not out of heartlessness, but because a working household needed both male and female labor. Still, there were moments of tenderness. Many couples had known one another for years, growing up side by side in the same village. The familiarity made the transition less daunting. Sometimes, A peasant bride entered marriage already pregnant, since premarital relations were not uncommon. In fact, church records suggest that many couples in medieval villages delayed their church weddings until a pregnancy was evident, ensuring that land would pass to legitimate heirs. And so, lying there on a straw bed in a darkened room, a peasant couple began their married life. No feasting lords waited for news. No treaties depended on their union. But the rhythms of the village, the harvest, the family, the household, rested on what began in that simple cottage. Yet one can't help but wonder in the silence of the night. With the smell of hay and smoke filling their lungs, did they think first of survival or of each other? When we left the new couple on their wedding night in the year 1250, they were settling into the narrow straw bed of a peasant's cottage. The celebration had faded, the neighbours had gone home, and life, in all its unadorned simplicity, was ready to continue. But the story of marriage in peasant society did not end with that first night. To truly understand the meaning of such a union, we need to look at how the rhythms of survival, religion, and community defined both the expectations of marriage and the quiet reality that unfolded after the feast. The first and perhaps most striking difference between noble and peasant marriages was scale. Nobles might mark their unions with months of negotiation, lavish feasts, and processions that drew in hundreds of guests. For peasants, marriage was more localized, negotiated between families in the same parish, and celebrated with resources that rarely extended beyond what the harvest had provided. All brewed in the household, a pig slaughter for the occasion, and bread baked in shared ovens. These were the elements of festivity. Once spent, life returned quickly to routine. This meant that the wedding night was less a singular dramatic event than the beginning of a new pattern. On the morning after, there was often no lingering in bed. The couple might rise at dawn, as they always had, to tend animals or work the fields. Marriage was a practical necessity, and its solemnities were quickly folded back into the endless cycle of labor. Still, the symbolism of consummation mattered deeply, not only to the couple, but to the community and the church. Priests emphasized the need for the marital act to ensure the legitimacy of future children. Without consummation, the union could be contested or annulled, leaving families in conflict over property or inheritance. To guard against this, communities developed customs that seem strange to modern sensibilities. In some regions, neighbors or relatives would accompany the couple to their bed, sometimes even remaining in the room until the pair were under the covers. This was not voyeurism in the sense we might imagine, but rather a public witness to the legitimacy of the union. In certain villages, songs were sung outside the cottage door, ribald verses urging fertility and mocking any hint of shyness. These practices, while uncomfortable to imagine, reveal how marriage was never entirely private. It was always embedded in the collective fabric of the village. Daily life reinforced this lack of privacy. Peasant homes were small, sometimes a single room shared by an entire family. Sleeping spaces might be divided by wooden partitions, but these offered little insulation from sound or movement. Children often slept nearby, as did parents, siblings, or even farm animals brought indoors for warmth. This meant that intimacy between husband and wife required a kind of unspoken acceptance from the household. Quiet discretion, rather than romance, defined the marital bed. At the same time, fertility was never far from people's minds. A new bride was expected to prove her fecundity quickly. Pregnancy was both a blessing and a practical reassurance that the marriage had taken root. Midwives, neighbors, and family all watched for signs. Within months, the rhythm of a woman's body became a subject of communal interest. For children meant security. More hands to sow and reap. More assurance that parents would be cared for in old age. Yet pregnancy was not without risk. Childbirth was a leading cause of death among women, and the crude conditions of peasant homes offered little safety. The wedding night, therefore, marked not only the hope of fertility, but also the beginning of a lifetime of physical danger. Each new child was a triumph, but also a trial, endured with the quiet resilience that defined peasant life. The emotional landscape of these marriages varied widely. Some couples were arranged by their parents, matched for the practical advantage of combining small plots of land or pooling resources. Others, however, married out of affection or even love. Church authorities disapproved of marriages based purely on parental arrangement, stressing that mutual consent was required. But in practice, social and economic pressures weighed heavily. What this meant for the wedding night is hard to know. For some, it was a continuation of an already familiar bond. For others, it was the awkward meeting of strangers bound by necessity. Still, within the framework of duty and survival, affection often grew. Accounts from medieval villages show couples who worked side by side in the fields, raised children together, and developed lasting partnerships. If the wedding night was quiet, awkward, or even perfunctory, the years that followed often gave it deeper meaning. The marriage bed, humble as it was, became the center of family life, the place where children were conceived, where sickness was endured, and where lives ended. And so, when you picture the peasant couple on their straw mattress, surrounded by the muffled sounds of a sleeping household, remember that this was not just a single night of transition. It was the beginning of a partnership forged in labor, tested by hardship, and sustained by the unremarkable but vital routines of medieval rural existence. But what happened when marriage did not go smoothly? What if a union failed to produce children, or if tensions between families boiled over into disputes? When we left the peasant couple in their small, straw-filled bed, the story of their marriage had just begun. But not all unions were smooth, and the wedding night, while symbolic, was only the first step in a long path. Medieval peasant life was defined as much by struggle and conflict as by continuity, and marriage was no exception. One of the most pressing concerns in any marriage was fertility. As we noted earlier, a child was the living proof of a consummated union and a promise of security for both families. But when pregnancies did not follow, anxieties set in. The absence of children within the first few years could lead to quiet gossip in the village, whispered suspicions about a woman's health, or doubts about a man's virility. In such cases, neighbors might speculate openly. Remedies were sought: herbal brews, charms tied above the bed, prayers to local saints thought to intercede in matters of fertility. In parts of Europe, couples might even be sent on pilgrimages to shrines where the relics of holy figures were believed to bless barren marriages. The wedding night, once a symbol of hope, could instead become the silent reminder of failure. The church played a central role in such disputes. Priests had the authority to hear complaints, and though reluctant to meddle in intimate matters, they often became arbiters when marriage was questioned. If consummation had never taken place, a marriage could be annulled, freeing one or both partners to remarry. But proving non-consummation was complex, and testimonies from neighbors or family could be called upon. An intrusion into the private lives of the couple that feels almost unthinkable today. In extreme cases, accusations of impotence were brought before ecclesiastical courts. Trials could involve humiliating procedures, such as requiring a man to demonstrate his ability in front of witnesses or physicians. These episodes, though rare, underscore just how much weight medieval society placed on the fulfillment of that first wedding night. Marriage could also unravel through conflict. Peasant households were fragile units, and disputes over property, inheritance, or dowry payments often erupted. If a dowry promised by the bride's family was not delivered, resentment could fester. If land was at stake, extended families might become involved, pulling entire communities into quarrels. In such disputes, the intimacy of the couple's bed was overshadowed by the louder voices of family obligation and economic survival. Violence, too, was not absent from peasant marriages. Records from manorial courts occasionally mention wives who fled abusive husbands or men accused of mistreating their families, though divorce was almost unheard of, reserved only for the rarest of cases. Separations did occur, with women sometimes returning to their parents' homes. The wedding night, however it had begun, could become a memory tinged with regret rather than hope. And yet, despite these hardships, many marriages endured. Ordinary men and women, bound together not by luxury or romance, but by the sheer necessity of survival, often built lives of remarkable resilience. The peasant bed, narrow and lumpy, was still the place where companionship grew. A husband and wife might share whispered conversations at night after the day's labor, exchange warmth during the cold months, or laugh quietly while their children slept nearby. These small unrecorded moments rarely entered the chronicles of history, but they were as real and as important as the grander unions of kings and queens. For peasants, the wedding night was not the climax of a love story. It was the beginning of a partnership that had to withstand hunger, sickness, and the unyielding demands of the soil. When we step back, it becomes clear that the wedding night in peasant homes was less about ceremony and more about survival. The straw mattress, the crowded room, the expectations of family and church, all of it framed the night not as an ending, but as the opening line in a lifelong struggle to endure. And so we return to the small cottage of our imagined couple. The feast is long over. The guests have gone home. The fire burns low in the hearth. On the straw bed lie two people, newly bound together, unsure of what the future will hold. Will their marriage bring children, prosperity, and companionship? Or will it falter under the weight of hardship and unmet expectations? The 18th century, a time when London was bustling with trade, fashion, and social rituals, but also filled with shadows, flickering oil lamps, and watchful neighbors. Our story explores what young men and women did when the sun went down, how courtship unfolded under candlelight, and the quiet rituals that shaped relationships in Georgian London. You just woke up in the London of the mid-1700s. The air is thick with coal smoke. The cobblestones glisten with dampness from the evening rain, and the streets hum with the sounds of carriages and vendors calling out the last of their wares. But for you, tonight is not about trade or politics. It's about visiting the home of a young woman you're courting, a ritual that was common yet tightly bound by rules of etiquette, reputation, and family supervision. Evening visits were at the heart of Georgian courtship. Unlike the noisy, public world of markets or coffee houses, these meetings unfolded in the semi-private spaces of drawing rooms and parlors. A young man would call upon a young lady at her family's home, often with a candle lit in the hall to signal hospitality. These visits were not spontaneous. They were carefully timed, approved by parents, and shaped by unwritten codes of behavior. The hour of the visit mattered. Too early in the day, and it might look like the caller was intrusive. Too late, and it could be seen as improper. Arriving between 6 and 8 o'clock was considered polite when the household had settled from supper, but before the evening grew too late. Inside, the atmosphere was hushed. The room might be lit by a single cluster of candles or an oil lamp, casting long shadows on the walls. Conversation had to carry the courtship. There were no dances or feasts to distract. A man might compliment the young lady's embroidery, inquire about her music lessons, or speak about the latest pamphlet he had read in a coffee house. Every word carried weight, for parents or chaperones might be listening from the next room. These visits were about patience and persistence. Rarely did a man profess his love openly in the first meetings. Instead, his intentions were measured through his reliability. Did he return regularly? Did he speak with respect? Did he seem earnest in his pursuit, or was he too casual? For the young woman, the visits were a chance to observe character as much as charm. She would note whether her suitor removed his hat with proper decorum, whether he refrained from gossip, and whether he spoke of steady employment or inheritance. Courtship was, at its core, a negotiation of futures. Families were always part of the equation. A young man without sufficient means was unlikely to be welcomed for long, no matter how charming his words under candlelight. Conversely, a young woman without dowry or connections could be passed over in favor of one whose marriage brought financial or social advantage. Yet, within these constraints, there was also room for quiet intimacy, sitting near a fire, speaking in low tones, exchanging a fleeting glance when parents looked away. These moments created a rhythm of expectation. A candle might burn low, the shadows deepening, and with it, the tension of unsaid words. Many young men rehearsed confessions of love in their minds, only to leave without ever speaking them aloud. Sometimes, visits grew daring. A hand might brush against a sleeve, or a letter might be slipped into a book and left behind. But such risks were dangerous. Rumours in London spread quickly, and a lady's reputation could be damaged by even the suggestion of impropriety. This was why candles and evening lamps mattered so much. They created both the possibility of intimacy and the ever-present reminder of watchful eyes. It is worth remembering that candlelight was not merely an atmospheric detail, but a practical reality. With no gas lamps yet in widespread use, and no electricity, the glow of a tallow candle or beeswax taper determined how people moved, how long they stayed awake, and how much they revealed of themselves to one another. The flicker of the flame could lend an air of romance, but it could also be a reminder of limitation. A candle that burned out too soon could abruptly end an evening's conversation. As you sit here, imagining yourself in that parlour, the room smells faintly of wax and smoke. The chairs are wooden, the cushions worn, the fire faint. A young woman sits across from you, her hands folded neatly, her gown rustling softly when she shifts. A chaperone lingers nearby, pretending to mend but listening closely. You search for words that might bridge the silence, knowing that each sentence could shape her impression of you, and perhaps the rest of your life. But what happens when words are not enough? What if the flicker of candlelight carries something more, a hint of a deeper emotion, a desire restrained by custom? And what risks were couples willing to take when the city outside hummed with anonymity, and yet the walls within held them under constant scrutiny? And so we end this first part of our story. Evening visits in 18th century London were small in scale, but enormous in meaning, each encounter a careful balancing act between propriety and longing. But what happened when these visits stretched on week after week? How did candlelight conversations give way to proposals, or, just as often, disappointments? Evening visits, though seemingly simple, formed the very backbone of how relationships unfolded in Georgian London. Once a young man had begun calling regularly, his presence in the household became a kind of ritual. Families judged him not only by what he said, but by how consistently he appeared at the door. In fact, punctuality was considered a sign of seriousness. A gentleman who promised to arrive on Tuesday and then failed to appear could expect whispers, if not outright disapproval. But the visits were not just about the couple. Parents, siblings, and even servants played their roles. A mother might sit nearby with her sewing, occasionally interjecting with polite questions about the young man's family connections or his future prospects. A father might drift in later, nodding with a kind of solemn acknowledgement, while quietly taking mental notes of the suitor's manners. Sometimes, younger siblings provided both amusement and annoyance. A brother might tease, interrupting conversations, or deliberately knocking over a candle to test the suitor's composure. A sister might linger in the doorway, curious about whether her older sibling suitor would someday bring wealth, or merely more mouths to feed. Courtship, in this sense, was rarely a private affair. It was a household matter, woven into the rhythm of domestic life. Despite this scrutiny, young couples still found ways to carve out moments of near privacy. A piano might be brought into the parlour, and the young lady would play a simple tune, giving the couple a chance to sit side by side while others listened in silence. Sheet music, passed back and forth, sometimes carried hidden notes or underlined words, turning an innocent pastime into a coded form of conversation. Another common ritual was reading aloud. A book of poetry or travel writing might be chosen, and the suitor would read in a steady voice while the family listened. The choice of text mattered. Too frivolous, and he might seem unserious; too heavy, and he risked boring his audience. But if chosen well, it allowed him to show learning, refinement, and a sense of taste, all under the gentle glow of candlelight. The very act of reading together was considered intimate. Words carried across the room, but the meaning could settle more closely between two people than anyone else noticed. A pause before a particularly romantic line, a careful glance while speaking of distant adventures. These subtle gestures lingered long after the evening had ended. It was not only what was said and done, but also what was eaten and drunk. Evening visits often included light refreshments, tea, biscuits, candied fruits, or even a glass of fortified wine if the family was more indulgent. Tea, still expensive, was a symbol of refinement and social standing. The way it was served, whether with delicate porcelain cups or more modest mugs, spoke volumes about a household's position. Offering tea to a suitor was both an act of hospitality and a subtle test of manners. Did he hold the cup properly? Did he stir without clinking the spoon against the porcelain? Such tiny details were quietly observed. Candles themselves became part of the ritual of timing. Families knew that the number of candles burned in an evening represented expense, since wax was costly. A lingering visit might exhaust not only conversation, but also the household's willingness to keep supplying fresh light. Sometimes a servant would enter discreetly to snuff a candle, a silent signal that the evening was drawing to a close. For the couple, each visit built upon the last. If things went well, there might be a growing ease, a laugh shared more freely, a question asked more directly. If things went poorly, the distance between them grew more obvious with every flicker of the candle. A suitor who rambled too long without purpose, or who lacked attentiveness to small courtesies, would soon find the family less welcoming. But for those who connected, even slightly, the candlelit parlor became a space of gentle possibility. Imagine the quiet excitement of hearing a familiar knock at the door, the shuffle of footsteps in the hall, and then the warm glow of a candle revealing the same face week after week. Each visit was a step forward, though the path was never guaranteed. Some visits ended with polite farewells, others with hints of more. A young man might ask permission to call again, bowing carefully as he left. A young woman might offer a small smile or a word of encouragement as the door closed behind him. Outside, the streets of London were still lively, carriages rattling past, vendors shouting, dogs barking. But inside, in the memory of that candlelit room, something had shifted. So how did these visits progress into deeper commitments? At what point did a family expect an offer of marriage, and how did couples navigate the delicate transition from polite evenings to lifelong promises? As evening visits accumulated, the gentle ritual of candlelit courtship slowly transformed into expectation. In Georgian London, patience was admired, but too much hesitation could bring whispers of wasted time. A family that allowed a suitor into their parlor week after week would eventually begin to wonder when, or if, he intended to make his intentions clear. Marriage in the 18th century was rarely left to sentiment alone. It was as much a negotiation of practical matters as it was of affection. Families considered wealth, social standing, and connections with as much care as the couple considered personal compatibility. And yet, affection was not absent. In fact, the candlelit evenings gave room for feelings to grow within the carefully supervised structure of courtship. When a suitor had proven himself steady in his visits, polite in his manners, and sufficiently promising in his prospects, the talk turned toward arrangements. Sometimes this began with indirect remarks, perhaps a father asking, in a seemingly casual tone, what plans the young man had for the future. Other times it was more deliberate, with the suitor himself requesting a private word to express his desire to marry. Even then, the proposal was not the grand, public affair we imagine today. There were no kneelings with diamond rings before astonished onlookers. Instead, it was often quiet, even businesslike. A young man might declare his admiration, an intention to marry directly to the father of the household, rather than to the woman herself. Only once parental approval had been secured could the matter be more openly discussed with the intended bride. For the woman, her own wishes mattered more in some households than in others. Among wealthier families, alliances and inheritances often outweighed personal preference. Yet even in these circles, evening visits provided her with an opportunity to form impressions and quietly influence the decision. A woman who found her suitor dull, careless, or unpleasant could express her disinterest subtly, by being less welcoming, shortening conversation, or retreating behind polite reserve. Among the middling and artisan classes, affection sometimes held more weight. Evening visits, repeated over weeks or months, allowed genuine bonds to form. When such couples finally reached an agreement to marry, it often carried both the blessing of family and the satisfaction of personal choice. The transition from evening visits to engagement was marked by subtle changes in ritual. The suitor might be welcomed into the household with less formality, treated almost as family rather than guest. He might be allowed to walk the young woman home from church, or even to sit beside her at meals. Once engaged, the watchful presence of parents could relax slightly, though true privacy was still rare until marriage. Engagement itself was not always a brief affair. Months could pass while financial settlements were arranged, dowries negotiated, and practical details secured. During this time, candlelit visits continued. Now with a greater sense of certainty, couples might discuss plans for their future household, where they would live, how money would be managed, what role each would play in their shared life. And then came the wedding day itself, often less romantic than we imagine, but deeply significant. After vows were spoken and celebrations concluded, the rituals of evening visits gave way to a new ritual, the first night spent together as husband and wife. Families might still linger nearby, ensuring propriety was observed until the very last moment, but at last the long courtship gave way to the realities of married life. The candles that had once lit cautious conversations now illuminated the first hours of partnership. And though marriage would bring its own challenges, financial strains, domestic responsibilities, the endless routines of daily survival, it began with the memory of those evenings, when the world seemed to pause, and a single flame between two people marked the fragile beginnings of something lasting. When we look back on these rituals today, they may seem restrained, even tedious, yet within them lay a structure that allowed love to grow cautiously, tested not only by the couple, but by the watchful eyes of family and community. Evening visits were less about dramatic declarations and more about endurance, about proving, week by week, that affection could be steady, respectful, and real. And so, the quiet knock at a London door in the 18th century, followed by the careful lighting of a candle, was more than just a polite call. It was the beginning of a lifetime, shaped not by haste but by patience. With that, our story of candlelit courtship comes to a close. But what happened in other times and places? How did customs of courtship differ when traditions were shaped not by candles in London parlours, but by ancient rituals, outdoor festivals, or even communal matchmaking? In 14th century London, a city alive with the bustle of trade, the smell of tanners' yards, the clang of blacksmiths, and the chatter of apprentices, guilds governed much of daily life here. And if you were born into a guild family, your future, including whom you would marry, was deeply shaped by the customs and expectations of these institutions. To understand matchmaking among guild families, you must first picture London as it was in this period. Narrow streets twisted between wooden houses that leaned precariously over the lanes. Shops were often attached to homes, with workrooms in the back and apprentices sleeping above the shop floor. Guilds regulated every trade, from bakers and weavers to goldsmiths and mercers. Membership brought not just the right to practice a craft, but also a network of protection, reputation, and influence. Marriage in this world was rarely left to chance. Instead, it was a careful negotiation that bound families together, ensured apprenticeships, and preserved wealth. A master craftsman would think long before marrying off a daughter, and an aspiring journeyman could not hope to secure a good match without proving his skill, sobriety, and ability to provide. For daughters of guild families, marriage was often the single most important contract of their lives. Unlike men, who might inherit a shop or take up a trade, women's futures depended heavily on the alliances their families arranged. A daughter married into the right household could strengthen the family's influence within the guild, while a poor match might weaken it. Courtship, as we think of it today, was almost non-existent. Instead, marriages were brokered through extended networks of guild connections. Fathers and mothers considered apprenticeships, dowries, and workshop ownership with the same seriousness as others might consider love or compatibility. Love might follow, or it might not. But what mattered most was the stability of the family line. Dowries were central to these arrangements. A guild daughter did not usually come empty-handed to her marriage. Her family would provide money, goods, or sometimes even property to her husband. ensuring that he could establish or expand his business. In return, her husband offered the security of his trade and his guild standing. Apprenticeship also played a surprising role in matchmaking. A promising apprentice might first enter a master's household to learn a trade, but over the years, if he proved reliable, he could become a candidate for marriage to the master's daughter. This blending of professional training with marital negotiation blurred the line between business and family in ways that shaped generations. But guild families were also cautious. They knew that a poorly chosen match could mean financial ruin, disputes within the guild, or the loss of hard-earned prestige. To guard against this, negotiations often involved not just the immediate families, but also trusted members of the guild. In this sense, marriages were community affairs, decisions made with the knowledge that they affected the reputation of the entire trade. And so, when a guild daughter reached marriageable age, the process began quietly. Families observed, discussed, and consulted, considering potential matches with the kind of diligence one might devote to securing a lucrative contract. Evening visits, like those of the later Georgian period, were not the norm here. Instead, matches were proposed in workshops, guildhalls, and sometimes even over shared meals during feasts or holy days. It is in these hidden, practical negotiations that the true nature of marriage in London's medieval guild families emerges. Less about romance and more about survival, these unions ensured the continuity of crafts, the stability of businesses, and the steady weaving of community life. But how exactly were these negotiations carried out? What words were spoken? What rituals observed? And how did families weigh the risks of trust and betrayal when so much was at stake? When you picture matchmaking among London's medieval guild families, you must imagine a process that was both public and private, guided by ritual, but also shaped by quiet, practical conversations behind closed doors. Unlike the romanticized visions of courtly love sung by troubadours in noble courts, the world of guild marriages was one of careful calculation. The first stage often began with reputation. A father or master craftsman would consider who among his apprentices or his fellow guildsmen might make a suitable match. Reputation was everything. Was the young man known for diligence, sobriety, and respect for authority? Or was he rumored to drink too heavily at the tavern and shirk his duties at the workbench? These judgments could make or break a potential match long before negotiations ever began. For young women, reputation carried equal weight. A daughter who was skilled at household management, who could weave, sew, or keep accounts, was valued as a future wife who would help maintain the stability of the business. A daughter who had too much of a temper, or who was careless with money or behavior, risked making her family look foolish in the eyes of the guild. Once reputations had been weighed, the next step involved informal approaches. Often, this happened during guild feasts or holy day gatherings. The guild feast was not just about food and fellowship. It was also a place for subtle matchmaking. A father might sit beside another family and strike up a conversation about the future, testing the waters with a quiet mention of a son or daughter's readiness to marry. If there was mutual interest, more serious discussions followed. These took place in homes, in back rooms of workshops, or occasionally within the very halls where guild members gathered to settle disputes and draft ordinances. At this point, the focus shifted to practical matters, the size of the dowry, the prospects of the groom, and the arrangements for workshop ownership or partnership. The dowry could include not only coin, but also physical goods, tools of the trade, bolts of cloth, or even part ownership in a shop. For example, a weaver's daughter might bring a loom and wool stock as part of her dowry, ensuring her husband's business could expand immediately. This was no small matter. The future of entire households rested on such contributions. It is worth pausing here to note how deeply business and family life overlapped. Unlike today, where we tend to think of work and marriage as separate spheres, in medieval guild London, they were tightly interwoven. To marry was to secure one's professional future, as much as one's personal life. This intertwining also explains why the guild itself often played an indirect role in matchmaking. Senior members sometimes advised on marriages, and the guild ordinances ensured that disputes over inheritance or dowries were handled in ways that kept the trade stable. To marry well was not just a private achievement, it reinforced the entire guild's reputation for respectability and order. The negotiations themselves could be lengthy. Families debated not only money and property, but also expectations. Would the young couple live with the bride's family for a time, or would they move into the groom's workshop? Would the bride's dowry remain hers in case of widowhood, or would it become fully absorbed into her husband's business? These questions mattered, because in an era of frequent illness and early death, widowhood was common, and women needed some security to carry on. And then came the betrothal. This was not the wedding itself, but a formal agreement, often sealed in front of witnesses. Sometimes hands were clasped, sometimes coins or gifts exchanged, and words spoken to bind the families together. Though less ceremonious than the noble contracts of kings and queens, these agreements were binding in the eyes of both the church and the community. Breaking a betrothal could bring shame, loss of reputation, and even legal disputes. Yet beneath these formalities, one must wonder what the young men and women thought of it all. For some, the arrangement was a welcome chance to step into adulthood with security. For others, it may have felt like a cage, with little room for choice or affection. Love might bloom after the wedding, or it might not. But in the eyes of the guild, what mattered was not love but stability. This delicate balance between family ambition, personal fate, and the guild's collective order shaped hundreds of lives across London's bustling neighbourhoods. Each marriage tied not just two people, but two households, two workshops, and two sets of obligations together. But what happened once the match was made, the betrothal sealed, and the day of the wedding arrived? How did guild families celebrate these unions, and what rituals marked the crossing from negotiation into marriage itself? The wedding day for a guild family was not a grand affair on the scale of royal or noble courts, yet it carried enormous weight within the narrow lanes of London. Neighbours, apprentices, fellow guild members, and kin all took notice, for each wedding was both a personal milestone and a public signal of stability. The day often began early, with preparations filling the household. For the bride, this meant dressing in her best garments, often practical, but adorned with touches that reflected her family's pride. A cloak of rich wool, a belt with brass fittings, or a headdress lined with linen could transform an ordinary outfit into something fit for ceremony. For the groom, his best tunic or doublet would be worn, perhaps with a finely tooled belt or a borrowed cloak, if the family's resources were modest. The outward signs mattered. They spoke of a household ready to shoulder responsibilities and uphold the dignity of its guild. The church ceremony, simple but binding, was at the heart of it all. Unlike later elaborate rituals, most medieval guild weddings were conducted at the church door. Here, in front of witnesses, the priest would bless the union and recite the vows. The couple's hands might be joined together with a strip of cloth, a gesture known as handfasting. Coins might change hands, symbolizing dowry agreements, and then the couple would step inside the church to hear Mass. Marriage was thus both spiritual and practical, consecrated before God and recognized by the community. It was not merely about affection, but about legitimacy, ensuring children were born within a recognized union. Property could pass without dispute, and the guild itself could be assured of continuity in its members' households. Once the ceremony ended, attention shifted to celebration. Guild weddings often included feasts, though the scale varied. Wealthier families might provide roasted meats, fish, bread, and ale for many guests. Poorer families might gather only a small circle with more modest offerings. But even a small feast mattered. It affirmed the joining of families and allowed the wider community to share in the moment. The feast was not only about food. It was a setting where alliances were seen, where other families observed the stability of the match, and where future negotiations might quietly begin for younger siblings. Stories, songs, and laughter filled the air, while ale and wine loosened tongues. Guild officials, if present, might raise a toast, reminding all of the responsibilities that lay ahead for the new couple. As night fell, The marriage moved toward its most private moment, the bedding. Yet, even this was shaped by tradition and communal oversight. In many guild households, the couple was escorted to their chamber with merriment and teasing, accompanied by apprentices, friends, or kin. The community's presence reinforced the legitimacy of the union, while also ensuring that no suspicion could arise later about whether the marriage had been consummated. For the young bride and groom, this moment could be deeply awkward. They may have scarcely spoken in private before this night, and now they were expected to begin their life together under the watchful memory of their peers. Yet beneath the nervousness, there was also relief. Months, perhaps years of negotiation and waiting had finally resolved into a union sealed both by ceremony and by custom. From that night onward, the household changed. The young wife became not merely a spouse, but a partner in business, managing accounts, apprentices, and the rhythm of daily labor. The young husband bore responsibility not only for his craft, but also for his new family's security. The union was not the beginning of a love story as modern minds might imagine. It was the beginning of an enterprise, a partnership of survival and prosperity. This was the hidden weight of guild marriages. While some may have blossomed into warmth and affection, many were steady, practical arrangements that kept the wheels of London's economy turning. The guilds did not thrive on passion, they thrived on order, on contracts honored, on dowries secured, and on households that could endure hardship without collapsing. And so, behind each wedding feast and each awkward bedding lay the same unspoken truth. These marriages were not only about two people, but about the weaving together of families, trades, and entire neighborhoods into the larger fabric of the city. But if guild marriages represented stability and order in London, what happened in places where custom was less rigid? What of the countryside, where the hand of guilds and city laws was weaker, and where communities relied on different traditions to bind couples together? That, as we will see in the next story, leads us into a different corner of medieval marriage customs, one where village rituals carried as much weight as guild ordinances did in the city. London is bustling outside, with its coffeehouses, taverns, and flickering oil lamps lining the streets. But inside a modest townhouse, the focus of the evening is not on the city's noise, but on the slow ritual of courting by candlelight. Courtship in this age was a delicate balance of formality and opportunity. Unlike the medieval guild marriages of a century before, where unions were forged by family and trade, 18th century courtship in London allowed for a greater degree of personal interaction, though still framed by rules and social expectation. Young men and women of respectable families were not expected to meet unchaperoned on the street or to write freely to one another. Instead, the ritual of the evening visit became a central mechanism by which interest was expressed and relationships were cautiously tested. Picture the scene. A parlour lit by a handful of candles, their glow casting long shadows on the wood-panelled walls. Chairs are arranged neatly. Tea has been brewed, imported, expensive, and a subtle display of wealth. The young woman of the household sits nearby, with her mother or aunt in attendance. The suitor arrives, perhaps a little nervous, dressed in his best coat, his hair powdered, and his manners sharpened for the occasion. It was in such controlled environments that courtship unfolded, not in whispered secrecy, but in deliberate, measured exchanges. The conversations might seem dull by modern standards, talk of trade, theatre, the latest pamphlets, or the price of tea. But within these careful words lay hints of deeper feeling. A prolonged glance, a slight shift in tone, or the choice to stay just a little longer past the hour could all carry meaning. Evening visits carried expectations. For the man, they were a demonstration of seriousness. To spend one's evenings at the same household was a signal that intentions were not idle. For the woman, they were a test of patience and perception. Did she find this man agreeable, steady, and capable of supporting a future household? And always, the family watched, ready to intervene if the match seemed unsuitable or unwise. This rhythm of visits might continue for months. Suitors would come and go, sometimes welcomed, sometimes politely discouraged. For the young people themselves, this was both an opportunity and a constraint. There was room for affection to grow, but it grew in the light of candles and under the gaze of parents, never truly private until engagement was reached. And yet, despite the caution, the evening visit held a certain quiet intimacy. To share a firelit room, to sip tea together, to speak in a setting that blurred the line between public formality and private closeness. This was, in its own way, a courtship ritual as charged as any dance or letter. It was a moment where possibility hovered in the air, softened by the dim light and the slow ticking of the household clock. But how did these quiet evenings, shaped by custom and caution, eventually move from polite conversation into something more binding? What marked the shift from mere visiting to serious commitment? The quiet ritual of the evening visit was not only a practice of manners, it was a test of endurance. Londoners of the 18th century lived in a world where reputation was everything, and courtship unfolded under the constant gaze of neighbours, kin, and the broader community. Every evening spent in a young woman's parlour carried meaning, and every delay or absence sparked whispers. Unlike the more public rituals of dancing at assemblies or promenading in gardens, the evening visit was a repetitive and deliberate act. It was slow by design. A gentleman who visited once or twice might be dismissed as a casual caller. But one who returned week after week, perhaps bringing small tokens or engaging in longer conversations, gradually established his seriousness. The suitor himself faced a balancing act. If he pressed too quickly, he risked appearing reckless or insincere. If he lingered too long without a proposal, he risked being labelled a trifler, a man wasting a young woman's time and reputation. Families watched carefully for these signals because a woman's prospects were not infinite. Her window of opportunity for marriage narrowed with age, and extended visits without resolution could harm her standing in the eyes of others. The setting of the visit reinforced these dynamics. Parlours were designed to be both inviting and revealing. Chairs were arranged in ways that subtly controlled proximity. Candles burned low, their light both comforting and exposing. Tea, costly and imported, was served in fine porcelain cups, an offering that reflected the family's means, while also testing the suitor's manners. Did he handle the delicate saucer with care? Did he drink slowly, conversing with ease, or fidget in discomfort? Even conversation itself was an examination. The topics ranged widely, from the latest plays at Drury Lane to reports from the coffee houses, from imported goods arriving at the docks to the occasional political pamphlet. A gentleman's ability to speak with polish, avoid vulgarity, and show wit without arrogance mattered deeply. For the young woman, her responses were equally observed. Did she listen with patience, offer intelligent remarks, and display the modesty expected of her station? What makes these visits remarkable, when viewed from today, is how much significance was carried in such small gestures. A gentleman choosing to stay past 9 o'clock might be noticed. A woman choosing to walk her guest to the door herself, rather than letting a servant do so, could be read as encouragement. Even the arrangement of seating, the choice to sit nearer the suitor or to remain closer to her mother, spoke volumes. But such subtleties were not only about affection, they were also about negotiation. Marriage was, after all, a financial and social alliance as much as a personal union. During these visits, families quietly assessed not just personality, but also income, connections, and future stability. Courtship was less about passion and more about testing whether two households could merge without scandal, loss, or disappointment. And yet, despite the heavy watch of custom, there was room for quiet intimacy. Candlelight softened the edges of the room, making the parlour a kind of inn between space, not entirely public, yet not entirely private. Within its flickering glow, words could be spoken with more warmth, and glances could linger longer than they might in daylight. Still, the question loomed, when did visiting transform into engagement? There was no exact formula. Sometimes the gentleman declared himself formally, seeking the blessing of the woman's father, after weeks or months of calls. Sometimes families initiated the matter, pressing the suitor for clarity. And sometimes visits stretched on indefinitely, until either affection faded or circumstances forced a decision. For all its repetition, the evening visit was a fragile dance. It demanded patience, decorum, and endurance. It tested not just love, but the ability to endure silence, small talk, and the slow, deliberate march of custom. And for couples who succeeded, the parlor became the unlikely birthplace of a bond strong enough to move toward marriage. But what happened once that threshold was crossed? When visits gave way to proposals, and proposals gave way to betrothal, what new customs shaped the path from cautious conversation to the formal promises of engagement? The transition from parlor visits to formal engagement marked a decisive turning point in 18th century London courtship. A man who had spent countless evenings sipping tea, discussing plays, and exchanging carefully chosen words was expected, sooner or later, to move beyond courtesy and declare his intentions. Yet this step was rarely impulsive. Just as every visit had been weighed by the family, so too was the moment of engagement treated with careful formality. For many households, the first step was a discreet conversation between the suitor and the woman's father or guardian. This exchange was not about romance in the modern sense. It was about terms. The father might inquire about the young man's occupation, inheritance prospects, or connections. If the gentleman's circumstances seemed secure, and if the woman herself showed willingness, the families began discussions about dowry, joint property, and the responsibilities each household would assume. These negotiations could stretch on for weeks. In some cases, the bride's dowry was modest, consisting of a few pieces of land or household goods. In wealthier circles, sums of money, urban properties, or shares in trade companies were part of the settlement. Lawyers drew up agreements, ensuring that the bride would have provisions in widowhood and that any children would inherit according to the family's wishes. Marriage was, after all, as much a contract as a bond of affection. Yet even within these practicalities, the language of romance lingered. Engagements were often celebrated with tokens exchanged between the couple. A ring, sometimes plain and sometimes adorned with enamel or small stones, symbolized commitment. Lovers might exchange miniature portraits, lockets of hair, or carefully written letters, meant to be cherished in moments of absence. The words promise and faith appeared often in these gifts, binding emotion to the legalities of the contract. Public acknowledgement soon followed. Families held dinners to mark the agreement, inviting close kin and trusted friends. Neighbors began to speak of the match openly, and the couple could now appear together in public without suspicion. Walks through London's parks, shared attendance at the theatre, or visits to church as a pair became acceptable. Where once the parlour had been the stage of courtship, the city itself now became the backdrop for a more visible companionship. But even with engagement secured, the journey was not without its challenges. Weddings could be delayed by illness, by financial complications, or by parental disagreements. In some cases, engagements were broken altogether, leaving traces of disappointment that families often worked hard to conceal. A broken engagement carried social weight, and both men and women had to manage the whispers of neighbors who speculated on what had gone wrong. Those engagements that proceeded to marriage, however, brought with them new rituals. The wedding itself was both sacred and social, a union consecrated by the church, but also a display of hospitality to the wider community. Guests gathered, feasted, and observed the couple with a mixture of celebration and expectation. The union was not simply of two people, but of two households, their fortunes, and their futures. And yet, behind all the formality and ceremony, the memory of those quiet evening visits by candlelight lingered. The long hours of conversation, the careful glances, the slow testing of patience and sincerity, these formed the unseen foundation upon which marriages rested. For many, it was in those modest parlours, lit by a flickering flame, that true affection had grown. When we reflect on these rituals today, they may seem painstakingly slow, almost tedious compared to modern expectations. But within that slowness lay the security of intention. In a world where stability mattered as much as sentiment, where reputation could rise or fall on the smallest gestures, the evening visit offered a framework through which trust was built, families were reassured, and promises could be made with confidence. Perhaps the greatest lesson of this custom is that relationships were not measured by speed, but by endurance. A marriage born of countless evenings spent in quiet conversation was likely to be steadier than one forged in haste. Candlelight, patience, and the discipline of waiting, these were the tools by which love and stability were crafted in 18th century London. And so, the flicker of those candles, the creak of chairs in narrow parlours, and the murmur of polite conversation echo across time, reminding us that even in the most ordinary rituals, history leaves behind traces of human connection. London around the year 1380. The air smells faintly of smoke from hearth fires, and the streets are alive with the shuffle of apprentices carrying goods, the ringing of bells from parish churches, and the chatter of merchants calling out their wares. In this world, guilds dominate city life. Whether you are a weaver, a tanner, a goldsmith, or a fishmonger, your trade shapes your daily rhythms, and, in many cases, your family's future. Guilds were not merely professional associations. They were also powerful social institutions that dictated who could practice a craft, how apprenticeships were arranged, and how reputations were maintained. Membership meant protection, stability, and recognition, and because of this, guild families often intermarried, weaving webs of connection that reached across the city. If you were the son or daughter of a guild member, your marriage was not only about personal happiness. It was about sustaining the strength of your family's craft, expanding your household's business opportunities, and ensuring the guild itself remained a tight-knit community. The process could be surprisingly bureaucratic, resembling a small-scale negotiation between families, with each detail carefully considered. For young men, the path often began with apprenticeship. A boy might enter the household of a master craftsman around the age of 12 or 13, serving for several years in exchange for food, lodging, and training. During this time, he was watched closely, not just for his skill with the trade, but also for his behavior, character, and reliability. A master with daughters of marriageable age sometimes viewed his apprentices not only as future craftsmen, but as potential sons-in-law. For daughters, the situation was different. A young woman growing up in a guild household was expected to learn the domestic skills needed to manage a busy urban home, brewing ale, baking bread, keeping household accounts, and often assisting with aspects of her father's craft. She might spin thread for the weaving trade, prepare hides for the leather business, or sell goods in the marketplace. Her competence and good reputation added weight to her family's standing within the guild community, making her a desirable match. Marriage negotiations often started informally, through conversations between families. A father might mention his daughter's age to a fellow guildsman, hinting that he was open to discussing a match. If both sides saw potential, more serious talks followed. These discussions revolved around dowries, inheritances, and the promise of future apprenticeships or business ties. Dowries were especially important. A dowry might include money, land, or household goods such as bedding, cooking vessels, or livestock. In guild families, the dowry could also take the form of practical support for the husband's craft, for example, providing tools, raw materials, or even workshop space. In return, the groom's family offered assurances of financial security, and sometimes formal guild recognition that allowed the new household to prosper. Once agreements were made, a betrothal might be declared. This was not a private matter, but often a public acknowledgement within the parish or guild hall, binding both families together in expectation of marriage. Breaking a betrothal could lead to disputes, fines, or even court cases, since promises of marriage were considered legally significant in medieval England. For the couple themselves, the betrothal period was often the first chance to interact more openly. While marriages were arranged, that did not mean affection was absent. Court records and letters reveal instances where couples grew genuinely fond of each other, exchanging small gifts or tokens of loyalty. Still, they were always aware that the match served larger purposes than romance alone. In this way, London's guild families wove together love, duty, and trade. Marriage was not only a private union, but a public alliance, binding together workshops, households, and future generations in the service of craft and commerce. Yet one might wonder, how did these couples, bound together by negotiation and obligation, find space for personal feelings. When the negotiations between guild families were settled, the next stage was the wedding itself, a moment that blended religious solemnity, social ritual, and economic symbolism. For the young couple, it marked the beginning of a new household. For their families, it was the visible proof that their arrangements had succeeded. And for the guild, it was yet another knot tied in the web of alliances that held London's crafts together. Marriages were typically celebrated within the parish church. This was not only for religious reasons, but also because the church functioned as a community stage, where everyone could witness and confirm the union. Priests conducted the service at the church door, with the couple standing outside in public view. Only after vows were exchanged would they move inside for a blessing. This detail mattered greatly because marriage was as much a public contract as it was a private bond. The vows themselves were simple yet binding. The bride and groom clasped hands, declaring their intent to remain faithful, for better or worse, for richer or poorer. But what surrounded the vows, the witnesses, the presence of guild members, the exchange of tokens, was equally significant. Guild leaders sometimes attended to lend their approval, ensuring that the union was recognized not just by the church, but by the wider community of craftsmen. Wedding celebrations varied depending on wealth. In prosperous guild families, say the goldsmiths or mercers, the festivities could be lavish, with feasts of roasted meats, spiced wine, and music filling the air. Tables might be spread with trenchers of bread, platters of fish, and puddings made with honey and almonds. Wine imported through London's busy docks added a touch of luxury, while minstrels or fiddlers provided entertainment. For more modest guild households, the feasts were simpler, perhaps stews, pottage, and all brewed in the bride's family home, but they were no less meaningful. The emphasis lay not in extravagance, but in gathering family, neighbours, and guild fellows to mark the union. It was common for guests to contribute gifts, bolts of cloth, tools, or even small sums of money to help the young couple establish themselves. What makes these weddings distinct is the blending of domestic economy and social obligation. Every detail, from the food on the table to the seating arrangements, reinforced the bonds between families. The groom's family might display goods produced by their craft, while the bride's relatives ensured that her dowry was presented for all to see, a tangible sign of her contribution to the new household. The guild itself often played a role in reinforcing these unions. Some guilds maintained funds to assist members' families with weddings, especially when apprentices married into their master's household. Others enforced moral standards, ensuring that members married respectably, avoiding matches that could tarnish the guild's reputation. Marriage within the guild system also had long-term implications. A young man who married the daughter of his master gained not only a wife, but often a pathway to full guild membership and access to trade privileges. For women, marriage ensured continuity of household and workshop, and in some cases, widows could even continue to run their late husband's business. An important reminder that women were not passive in this system, but active participants in maintaining craft traditions. Daily life for these couples after the wedding reflected the practical side of their union. Their homes often doubled as workshops, with the living quarters above and the business below. A goldsmith's front room might display finely worked jewellery, while the back was filled with tools, apprentices, and the ringing of hammers. A brewer's home smelled constantly of hops and malt, with barrels stacked in the yard. The household was a shared enterprise. Husbands often handled external trade, negotiating with merchants and customers, while wives oversaw domestic production, accounts, and the labour of apprentices or servants. In this way, marriage was not just personal companionship, but an economic partnership, with both partners' labour sustaining the family's livelihood. And yet, even amid all the duties and obligations, the question lingers: did these guild marriages leave room for personal affection, or were they too deeply entangled in the machinery of commerce? The surviving records, court cases, wills, and guild ordinances offer glimpses, but never the full picture. Some couples seem to have found companionship and trust, Others remained bound by necessity more than choice. As we step into the final part of this story, we'll look more closely at the real lives behind the contracts, at how couples navigated expectations, the role of women in guild households, and what happened when these careful alliances broke down. To understand how marriages functioned inside London's guild system, it helps to look at what happened after the wedding, the daily balancing act of expectations, labour, and survival. Newlywed couples quickly discovered that their marriage was less about romance and more about keeping the household afloat. A household in medieval London was a complex organism. It produced goods, managed apprentices, trained servants, and maintained ties with extended kin and neighbours. For couples tied to guilds, the household was also an advertisement of status, discipline, and reliability. The husband was often the public face of the business. He met customers, negotiated prices, and attended guild meetings where rules of trade were discussed and disputes settled. Yet, the wife was equally essential. She handled bookkeeping, managed apprentices, oversaw supplies, and kept the household orderly. In some cases, she even worked at the craft itself, brewing ale, cutting cloth, or gilding metalwork, skills learned from her family before marriage. This partnership was not equal in formal terms, but in practice, wives' labour kept guild households viable. When husbands died, many widows stepped into their roles, keeping businesses alive. Records from the London Brewers Guild show widows continuing to run taverns and alehouses, while others maintained textile workshops. Far from being silent partners, women were integral to sustaining the craft economy. Marriages among guild families also involved negotiating loyalty between kin and craft. A groom might owe his allegiance to his master's household, even after marriage, while a bride might struggle to balance loyalty to her birth family with her new responsibilities. These tensions sometimes erupted in disputes over dowries, property, or apprenticeships. Court records from the London Mayor's Court reveal such quarrels in painstaking detail. A clothworker's widow once sued her late husband's guild for failing to honour her right to continue his business. In another case, a bride's family withheld part of her dowry, claiming the groom's family had not fulfilled certain promises. These disputes remind us that beneath the polished surface of ceremonial alliances, marriages could become sites of friction. Still, the guilds sought to keep such disputes contained. By promoting endogamy, marrying within the craft, they reinforced solidarity. If a tanner's daughter married a tanner's son, any disputes remained in the family, so to speak, under the watchful eye of guild leadership. This helped maintain trust within the trade, ensuring that goods could flow smoothly through the city's markets. And yet, amid these practical concerns, there are traces of human warmth. In wills preserved in London's archives, husbands often left personal tokens to their wives: a favourite cloak, a book of prayers, or jewellery made by their own hands. Wives, in turn, sometimes requested burial beside their husbands, suggesting bonds that extended beyond business contracts. The evidence is fragmentary, but it hints that love and affection could coexist with duty and obligation. For some couples, partnership may have blossomed into companionship. For others, the weight of guild expectations may have stifled it. The guild marriage system slowly evolved in later centuries. As trade expanded and London grew into a commercial hub, alliances shifted. By the 16th century, marriage increasingly reflected individual choice, though parental influence and economic concerns never disappeared. But in the medieval world, marriage within the guilds remained primarily a matter of stability, inheritance, and trust. What these marriages reveal is not a story of passion, but of practical resilience. Couples built lives together under the watchful eyes of family and guild, finding ways to balance labour, loyalty, and affection. They remind us that marriage has never been a static institution. It has always reflected the needs of society at a given moment. So as we leave the cobbled streets of London's medieval guilds behind, one might ask, were these carefully arranged marriages a safeguard against chaos, or a cage that confined personal choice? Perhaps, in their quiet balance between necessity and humanity, they were both. We're heading out of bustling London and into the quiet villages of 15th century England. Life here moves at a slower pace, and weddings, though less formal than guild ceremonies, carry their own unique rhythms and expectations. We're going to explore what couples in rural communities typically experienced on their wedding nights, a mix of ritual, family presence, and domestic practicality. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Congratulations! You just woke up in a small village somewhere in England around 1480. The morning air is cool with mist, and the distant smell of smoke from peat fires mixes with the earthy scent of livestock in the yards. Villagers are starting their daily chores, tending crops, feeding animals, and mending tools. Amid this routine, one household stands apart: its wedding day. Unlike city weddings dominated by guild protocols, rural weddings were deeply intertwined with community life. The bride and groom often grew up in the same village, or at least in neighboring ones, and most guests were familiar faces. Everyone knew one another's families, occupations, and even small grievances, making gossip as important a fixture as food and drink. Preparation for the wedding was a collaborative affair. Neighbors might help with baking bread, brewing ale, or cleaning the home for guests. The bride's family ensured that the dowry, perhaps a cow, barrels of honey, or a chest of linens, was ready for presentation. Unlike the city, where gold or imported goods might dominate, rural dowries leaned toward practicality, items that could contribute to daily life and the productivity of a new household. The ceremony itself was simple. Most couples were married in the local parish church, often by a single priest who knew the families personally. There were no grand processions or elaborate feasts, just the essential vows exchanged before witnesses and God. Sometimes, the priest would conduct the marriage at the church door rather than inside, a tradition inherited from older English customs. This public gesture confirmed that the couple's union was legitimate, recognized by the entire community. After the church, attention turned to celebration, still modest but lively. Villagers brought food and drink to share pottages, roasted meats, cheeses, and barrels of ale. Music, often provided by a fiddler or simple homemade instruments, encouraged dancing and communal enjoyment. These gatherings were not just about marking the couple's union. They reinforced bonds among neighbors and ensured that everyone contributed to the well-being of the village network. Yet, despite the communal nature of the wedding day, the evening brought a shift toward intimacy. After feasting and dancing, the couple was escorted to their new home, often accompanied by laughter, teasing, and perhaps the occasional playful song. Unlike in cities, where guild oversight dictated strict procedures, the rural couple had a bit more privacy, but never complete isolation. Sometimes elder relatives would remain nearby, ensuring the couple was safe and that customs were respected. For the newlyweds themselves, the evening was a mixture of anticipation and nervousness. Many had never been alone together before, and now the expectation was that they would begin their married life in earnest. The first night could be awkward. The couple was aware of family expectations, community gossip, and the broader social weight of marriage. Yet within this tension also existed the quiet possibility of companionship, trust, and shared responsibility. One particularly interesting detail in village weddings was the role of folk traditions and small rituals. Some communities believed that certain actions on the wedding night would ensure fertility or happiness. A common practice was to sprinkle salt or grains around the bed, or to hang herbs overhead, combining superstition with practical domestic symbolism. These rituals were subtle and gentle, meant to bring reassurance rather than fear. Life after the wedding in a rural village shifted quickly into routine. The couple often moved in with one set of parents or established a new household on family land. Their days became a mixture of agricultural labor, domestic chores, and gradually shared decision-making. Marriage was less about passion in the modern sense and more about mutual support and survival. And yet, one might wonder, Within the constraints of village life and family oversight, how did affection and companionship emerge? Could couples shaped by practicality and custom find moments of personal intimacy? And if so, what did those moments look like in the quiet, candlelit rooms of a 15th century home? After the wedding day concluded, the couple faced their first true test as a married household, managing daily life together under both expectation and necessity. Unlike in London, where guilds provided a structured framework for family enterprise, rural couples relied on cooperation, shared labor, and the support of neighbors. Survival depended on both diligence and harmony, and the first days of married life were often devoted to establishing routines. The young husband's responsibilities were largely external. He tended the fields, repaired tools, and ensured that livestock were fed and healthy. Crop rotation, seed storage, and seasonal tasks dictated a rhythm that allowed little room for leisure. At the same time, he needed to show competence to his family and neighbors. Failure to manage the land or animals properly could lead to whispered criticism or diminished social standing. The bride's work was equally critical, though often less visible. She managed the household, prepared meals, milked animals, churned butter, and oversaw servants or younger siblings, if present. She might spin wool into thread, mend clothing, or prepare preserves for the coming winter. These duties were not merely domestic chores, they were essential to sustaining the family's livelihood. A household that ran smoothly was seen as a reflection of the bride's skill and temperament, and indirectly, of the family that raised her. Evening routines offered the couple their first opportunities for private interaction. Once the day's work was done and children or neighbors had retired, the newlyweds often gathered by the hearth, where they could share conversation, food, or a simple cup of ale. Candles or rushlights provided a dim glow, creating a space that was both warm and intimate. While not explicitly romantic in the modern sense, these moments allowed them to learn each other's habits, preferences, and temperaments, a subtle but essential bonding process. Sleep arrangements were often dictated by practicality. In some households, the young couple shared a bed in a corner of the main room. In others, they slept in a smaller attached chamber. Privacy was limited, and the presence of family members, servants, or visiting neighbors meant that initial intimacy was cautious and often punctuated by interruptions. Despite these constraints, the rituals of closeness, holding hands, sharing blankets, or exchanging whispered words, laid the groundwork for emotional connection. Folk customs played a surprising role in these early nights of marriage. Some villages practiced small superstitions to ensure fertility and harmony. Couples might place a broom at the foot of the bed, hang herbs such as rosemary for love and protection, or toss grains of wheat onto the hearth. These acts were gentle and symbolic, reflecting a worldview where domestic life was intertwined with both spiritual and practical concerns. They offered reassurance and a sense of shared purpose, creating a bridge between family expectations and personal agency. Children were often considered an inevitable and important part of married life. Families watched for signs of fertility, and a couple's ability to bear and raise children was tied not only to happiness, but to economic survival. In this context, early intimacy was less about romance and more about fulfilling social and familial responsibilities, though genuine affection often developed alongside these duties. Rural marriages also required negotiation of household roles. Conflict could arise if one spouse expected more labor or deference than the other was willing to give. Letters and oral traditions from the period hint at couples learning to balance authority and cooperation, sometimes humorously, sometimes through quiet compromise. These dynamics were not recorded in official histories, yet they shaped the rhythms of everyday life more than any formal decree could. The pace of village life, slow, repetitive, and deeply tied to the land, also allowed for reflection. Couples who worked side by side in fields or workshops had extended periods of time together, which fostered understanding and mutual reliance. Affection often grew quietly, almost imperceptibly, as daily routines intertwined and shared challenges forged bonds that were difficult to break. By the end of the first weeks, the couple had usually established a tentative routine. Work was divided, meals were coordinated, and evenings provided small moments of intimacy. The first nights of marriage, though often awkward and constrained by social norms, set the foundation for a partnership that blended survival, labor, and emerging personal connection. But this raises a lingering question. In a life so shaped by duty and expectation, how did couples find moments of genuine warmth, humor, and personal delight? Was affection a natural outcome of shared labor, or something that had to be consciously nurtured amidst the weight of obligation? That's where we'll pick up next in Section 3, exploring the first months of married life and the subtle ways companionship and love emerged in rural villages. In the weeks and months following a rural wedding, the daily realities of married life began to reveal themselves. For couples in 15th century villages, marriage was less about grand declarations of love and more about the quiet, persistent rhythms of labor, domestic management, and mutual dependence. These small, seemingly mundane acts laid the foundation for both practical survival and emotional connection. For the husband, mornings often began before dawn. He tended fields, cared for livestock, repaired fences, and prepared tools. Agricultural labor was physically demanding, leaving little time for leisure, yet amid the routines of planting, plowing, and harvesting, there were moments for subtle companionship, a shared walk to the barn, a conversation while milking cows, or a pause to enjoy a simple breakfast together. These moments, though brief, gradually built familiarity and understanding. The wife's day was no less demanding. She managed cooking, cleaning, laundering, and childcare if the couple had young siblings or extended family living nearby. She also prepared produce for sale or trade, spinning wool, weaving cloth, or churning butter. In wealthier households, she supervised apprentices or servants. Her work kept the household functional, and in doing so, created the conditions for both economic stability and private connection. The evenings offered the most consistent opportunities for intimacy. Couples would gather by the hearth, often sharing small tasks like mending clothes or shelling peas. The glow of candlelight or a flickering fire softened the harshness of the day, allowing conversation, quiet laughter, and gentle gestures. Though their interactions were bounded by custom and the presence of family, these moments created the beginnings of personal closeness. One particularly interesting aspect of rural wedding nights was the gradual merging of ritual and routine. While superstitions and folk customs, like placing herbs for fertility or sprinkling grain at the hearth, played a role, their purpose was not magical alone. They provided shared structure, marking the transition from courtship to household partnership. The couple's active participation in these small customs reinforced unity and offered reassurance that they were fulfilling their roles correctly. Children, as expected, became central to the household's purpose and identity. Fertility was a social and economic concern. Early efforts at intimacy were often guided by this awareness, subtly blending expectation with personal discovery. Records and letters from the period indicate that couples learned each other's rhythms over time, adjusting routines and domestic practices to accommodate shared goals. Through patience and repeated effort, bonds of companionship deepened. Conflict and negotiation were also part of rural married life. Couples sometimes disagreed over workload, priorities, or even minor household details. These disputes, though generally quiet, were instructive. Each small disagreement offered lessons in compromise, empathy, and strategy, skills that proved essential for long-term partnership. In a world without formal counseling or social services, these negotiations were the training ground for both survival and relational endurance. Affection, though subtle, was cultivated through shared labor, mutual support, and the occasional private moment. A husband might bring his bride a small gift from the market, or share the first fruits of the harvest. She might secretly reserve a portion of freshly baked bread for him, or weave a small token into a piece of clothing. These understated acts of care strengthened emotional bonds, while keeping the household functional. As months passed, the rhythm of rural married life became a mixture of work, community, and companionship. The couple's bond, initially guided by family expectation and social convention, grew through repeated experience, tending the land together, managing domestic duties, and navigating the occasional friction, what began as duty gradually incorporated genuine warmth, humor, and trust. The quiet predictability of village life allowed small gestures to accumulate, creating a shared history that anchored both partners in their new roles. Perhaps the most striking lesson from these rural weddings is that marriage was a craft in itself. Just as one learned to plow a field, milk a cow, or mend a roof, couples learned to manage obligations, care for each other, and nurture connection. Their success depended not on dramatic declarations of love, but on sustained effort, attentiveness, and the subtle cultivation of trust over time. And so, in the soft candlelight of a village home, with the distant sounds of animals and neighbors outside, we see the quiet, enduring patterns that shaped medieval marriages. Through shared labor, small rituals, and gentle negotiation, couples discovered how companionship could flourish even within the strictures of duty. History leaves us with a final question. In a world where marriage was shaped by survival, obligation, and custom, can the smallest, most ordinary acts of care, like sharing a hearth or a loaf of bread, be considered the true heart of intimacy?